There are some who say the universe was born in song, that before stars ignited and galaxies spiraled into being, there was only the music, a harmony so perfect, so absolute, that reality itself was merely its echo. In that first and final melody, every note had purpose, every silence had meaning. And when discord entered the composition, when pride twisted beauty into ambition, the song did not stop. It fractured. Sauron knew this truth better than most. He had been part of that song once, before the Fall, before Morgoth, before the Ring. He had sung in the choir of the Ainur, a voice of fire and order in the symphony of creation. But that was another existence, another eternity. Now there was no song at all, only screaming. Welcome to Untold Warhammer Relics, where forgotten universes collide and legends are reborn in darkness. The void between worlds is not empty. It is not silent. It is a throat, swallowing and regurgitating existence in convulsions of impossible geometry. When Mount Doom consumed the One Ring, when the fires of Samath Naur severed the anchor of Sauron's soul from Middle-earth's tapestry, his spirit did not dissolve into merciful oblivion. It fell, not down, not up, but sideways, through dimensions that had no names, past realities that screamed in colors mortal eyes were never meant to perceive. He tumbled through the spaces between atoms, between thoughts, between the dying breaths of gods and the birth cries of new hells. And then the warp found him. Or perhaps he found the warp. In that place, causality is a joke without a punchline. The immaterium opened beneath him like a mouth lined with teeth made of broken time. Sauron, formless, consciousness without anchor, plunged into a sea that was not water, but emotion made manifest. Rage crashed against him in crimson waves. Despair coiled around his essence like rotting tentacles. Ecstasy burned through him with the intensity of 1,000 suns. And change, constant, nauseating, beautiful change, threatened to unmake the very concept of what he had been. 4 presences circled him in that infinite moment, vast beyond comprehension, hungry beyond reason. The first was a throne of skulls floating in an ocean of blood, and from it radiated fury so pure it could shatter planets. Khorne regarded him with something approaching contempt. No blood on your hands, little ghost. No screams in your wake. You are hollow, worthless. The second was a garden of rot where every flower was a plague, and every tree bore fruit of sweet corruption. Nurgle extended a grandfatherly hand, pustules weeping with affection. Come, child, you are already dying. Why resist? Let me show you the peace of entropy, the love of decay. All things return to me in the end. The third was a palace of mirrors reflecting infinite possibilities, each more horrifying and wondrous than the last. Tzeentch laughed, a sound like glass breaking backward through time. Ah, but you are delicious, a schemer without a scheme, a dominator without domain. What will you become here, I wonder? What will you change into? The fourth was a symphony of sensation, a cathedral of excess where pain and pleasure were indistinguishable. Slaanesh whispered with lips that existed in 7 dimensions at once. Perfection called you once, didn't it? You sought to bring order to chaos, beauty to the broken. I can give you that again. I can make you more than you ever were. Sauron felt his consciousness, the iron will that had dominated Middle-earth for millennia, beginning to fragment. The warp was not simply hostile. It was incompatible with his fundamental nature. He was a being of Eru's music, a creature born from divine harmony, even if he had spent eons corrupting that song. But here there was no song, only noise, only madness given form and hunger. He tried to speak, to exert the dominion that had once bent Nazgul to his will and turned kings into slaves. But he had no mouth, no form, no anchor in reality. His essence began to thin, to dissolve like ink in water. I am. Who was he? What was he? Without the ring, without a body, without even the memory of his true name from before the fall, what remained? Pride. That remained. Pride had been his first sin and his last refuge. I am Sauron! His consciousness roared into the warp's cacophony. I am the abhorred, the deceiver, the lord of... The four powers pressed closer, their attention suffocating. They did not fear him. They were curious, like children who had found an insect from another world and wanted to see how long it would survive under a magnifying glass. Tzeentch's voice cut through the others. Let us see what you make of yourself, little tyrant. Let us see if order can survive where even hope is a lie. And with a gesture that rewrote causality, the architect of fate pushed. Sauron's essence shrieked across the warp like a bullet through flesh. And then, impact. Real space. Physical laws. Gravity. Time moving in one direction. Atoms. Matter. The blessed, agonizing structure of a material universe. He materialized on his hands and knees, if hands and knees were concepts that still applied to whatever form he now wore. The ground beneath him was metal, rusted and corroded, stamped with incomprehensible Gothic script, and the icon of a gear meshed with a skull. Warning klaxons wailed in the distance. The air tasted of promethium and desperation. Sauron tried to stand and screamed. The sound that tore from his newly formed throat was not words. It was pure, distilled anguish. Taking physical form in this universe was like forcing his spirit into a cage made of razors. Every molecule of his being rebelled against the constraints of matter. The warp's energies, which he had used to create this body, burned through him like acid, corroding the edges of his consciousness even as they gave him shape. He was diminished. So terribly, impossibly diminished. In Middle-earth, he had been a Maia, a power that could level mountains with a thought and corrupt the mightiest of hearts with a whisper. Here, taking form at all required every scrap of will he possessed. And maintaining it? That would require feeding on something. Soon. Slowly, agonizingly, Sauron forced himself upright. He wore no armor, no crown. His form was barely humanoid, tall and gaunt, wrapped in shadows that seemed more substantial than flesh, with eyes that burned with a light that had no source. He looked down at his hands and saw them flickering, translucent, barely real. The sky above was choked with ash and the burning wreckage of orbital debris. Massive structures, cathedrals to machinery, rose in the distance, many of them collapsed or burning. This world was dying, had been dying for a long time, and no one had bothered to grant it the mercy of a final death. Forge World Osuar. He did not know the name yet, but he could taste it in the ashes, a place where faith and technology had mated and produced only screaming offspring. In the distance, chanting. Mechanical voices raised in binary prayer. And beneath that sound, thrumming through the metal beneath his feet, something vast was stirring, something that dreamed in languages older than this wounded world. Sauron began walking toward the sound, not because he had a plan, not because he understood this new hell he had been cast into, but because after millennia of dominion, after eons of schemes and conquest, he knew one truth above all others. Power respected power, and worship created gods. If he was to survive this universe, if he was to become more than a ghost screaming in the dark, he would need to learn its rules, learn its faiths, learn what these strange, broken humans believed in with such fervor that their devotion leaked into the warp itself. And then, as he had done in Middle-earth, he would become the thing they worshipped. Behind him, unnoticed, The air shimmered with colors that should not exist. In the warp, 4 sets of eyes watched with interest. The game had begun. And in the deepest vaults of Osuar, in a tomb that had been sealed for 10,000 years, something ancient opened one great eye and whispered a single word in a language that predated the Imperium. Interloper. The chanting grew louder as Sauron approached. Not words, but cascading sequences of binary cant interwoven with high Gothic liturgy. It was a language of mathematics worshipping itself, of machines praying to the concept of function. To ears that had once heard the music of the Ainur, it was grotesque. And yet, beneath the mechanical cadence, Sauron detected something disturbingly familiar. Devotion. The ruined Manufactorum Cathedral rose before him like a broken tooth. Its walls were inscribed with prayers to something called the Omnissiah, rendered in flowing script and brutal industrial stamps. Gargoyles shaped like servo skulls leered from corroded buttresses. And at its heart, visible through the shattered rose window, stood a gathering of robed figures, half flesh, half machine, arranged in concentric circles around something enormous. Sauron felt it before he saw it, a psychic presence, vast enough to dwarf his own diminished essence. Not intelligent, not anymore, but containing the memory of intelligence, like the echo of a god's footstep. He pushed through the cathedral's shattered doors. The tech priests did not notice him at first. There were perhaps 30 of them, their biological components reduced to little more than nervous systems wrapped in sanctified steel. Mechadendrites writhed from their backs like the tentacles of brass squids. Their eyes, those that still possessed eyes, glowed with the cold luminescence of data processing. They stood before a titan. Even dormant, even entombed in corrosion and the ash of centuries, the war machine was magnificent. 60 meters of adamantium and faith, shaped vaguely like a man but transcending humanity in every dimension that mattered. Weapon mounts hung from its arms like the limbs of a crucified giant. Its head, a fortress unto itself, bore a single eye slit that had once gazed upon battlefields and rendered them into mathematical certainties of destruction. The tech priests were attempting to awaken it. Their chanting intensified, building toward some mechanical crescendo. One of them, draped in robes that crackled with residual radiation, raised a staff topped with a cog and skull icon. His voice, when he spoke, was synthesized into a dozen overlapping frequencies. By the motive force, by the sacred oils of Mars, by the Omnissiah's first equation, awaken, God machine. The Archmagos calls you from slumber. Awaken, and walk once more in the machine God's glory. Nothing happened. The Titan remained silent, its reactor cold, its machine spirit dormant or dead. The lead tech priest's shoulders sagged, a curiously human gesture from a being that had long ago abandoned most claims to humanity. He began to turn, to address his fellow priests with what might have been despair, when his augmetic eyes locked onto Sauron. For a moment, neither moved. Sauron stood in the cathedral's entrance, wrapped in shadows that flickered like dying flames, his eyes burning with light that had no warmth. To the tech priest's enhanced vision, he appeared as a cascade of errors, a walking paradox of data that refused to resolve. Biological but not, material but translucent, present but wrong. The tech priest's mechadendrites snapped to attention. Warning runes flooded his visual feed. His internal cogitators screamed contradictory threat assessments, and beneath all that mechanical analysis, some ancient, barely remembered instinct from his biological core whispered a single word: demon. Abomination! The synthesized voice boomed through the cathedral. Scrap code manifest. Warp corruption detected. Engage sanctification protocols. The other tech priests wheeled toward Sauron as one, their weapon systems deploying with pneumatic hisses. Plasma casters hummed to life. Arc welders sparked with lethal charge. One of them raised a hand that had been replaced entirely with a flamer nozzle, pilot light already ignited. Sauron did not move, did not speak. He simply observed. These beings were fascinating. They had mutilated themselves in service to their god, not out of Nurgle's love of decay, but out of a desire for perfection through function. They had looked upon their flesh and found it wanting, so they had replaced it with something more reliable, more pure. It was a kind of self-hatred that Sauron could appreciate. He had spent eons despising the limitations of form. The lead tech priest began chanting in a different mode now, harsh, staccato syllables designed to bind demons and purge corruption. His staff began to glow with a sickly green light. The others joined him, their voices creating a wall of sound meant to cage the thing they believed he was. And in that moment, Sauron felt it, the pull of their faith. It was not directed at him, not yet. They were calling upon their omnissiah, upon the machine god, upon ancient rites of banishment and purification. But faith, Sauron had learned long ago, was a river. And rivers could be redirected. He was starving. His essence was fraying at the edges, dissolving back into the warp's hungry void. He needed an anchor. He needed fuel. And these priests, with their fanatical devotion, their absolute certainty, their willingness to die for their mechanical deity, they were offering him a feast. Sauron opened his mouth and spoke his first words in this new universe. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the tech priest's chanting like a scalpel through flesh. I am not your enemy. The words were in Gothic. He had pulled the language from the priests' own minds without them noticing, sifting through their thoughts like data files. But beneath the Gothic, woven into its phonemes like a virus, was something older. The Black speech, adapted and mutated, carrying within it the weight of dominion. 3 of the tech priests collapsed immediately, their organic components seizing as Sauron's will crashed against their minds. The others staggered, their augmetic brains struggling to process input that violated every law of information theory they had been programmed to trust. The lead priest remained standing, though smoke now rose from the seams of his robes. You are corruption, he managed, each word costing him visible effort. No, Sauron said, taking a step forward. The shadows around him writhed with hunger. I am something far older than your petty demons. I am order. I am dominion. I am the will that shapes lesser wills into purpose. Another step. The tech priest's weapons tracked him but did not fire. They couldn't fire. Some part of them, the parts that were still human, still capable of awe, recognized that they were in the presence of something that transcended their binary understanding of demon and not demon. You seek to awaken your god machine, Sauron continued, his gaze shifting to the dormant Titan. You chant your prayers and perform your rituals, but it does not answer. Do you know why? The lead tech priest said nothing, could say nothing. Because you do not believe strongly enough. Sauron raised one translucent hand, and the shadows around him surged forward like living things. They poured across the cathedral floor, climbing the Titan's legs, wrapping around its torso, seeping into the cracks in its armor. The tech priests watched in horror as the darkness filled their god machine like oil filling an engine. And then Sauron pulled. Not on the Titan's mechanical systems. Those were beyond his understanding, at least for now, but on something else. On the psychic residue that clung to the war machine like a second skin. Every battle it had fought, every crew that had died within its hull, every prayer that had been spoken in its cockpit. All of it was still there, imprinted on the Titan's structure like memory on matter. And Sauron devoured it. The sensation was exquisite agony. The psychic energy was incompatible with his essence, like trying to digest poison, but he forced it down, forced his being to adapt, to metabolize faith meant for another god. He felt his form solidify, become more real, more present. The burning pain of manifesting in real space eased slightly. But more than that, he learned. Through the residual memories clinging to the Titan, he glimpsed this universe's true nature. The Imperium of Man, a galactic empire of such staggering brutality and faith that it made Mordor look like a provincial kingdom. The Emperor, a figure worshipped as a god despite, or perhaps because of, being entombed in eternal agony. The Warp, not a void between worlds, but a reflection of every soul's darkest dreams. And the Chaos Gods, the four powers he had encountered, who were not ancient evils that had corrupted a good universe, but rather the universe's natural conclusion, emotion made manifest, given form and hunger. This was a cosmos where faith literally shaped reality, where belief could manifest as power, where 10,000 years of worship had given birth to gods both false and terrifyingly real. Sauron began to laugh. It was a sound the tech priests had never heard from any demon. Not mad cackling, not malicious glee, but genuine, almost relieved laughter. The laughter of a craftsman who had been given inferior materials for so long that he had forgotten what quality felt like, and had just been handed the finest tools imaginable. "You worship the Omnissiah," he said, his voice stronger now, more solid. "The machine god, the source of all knowledge, all function, all sacred technology." He gestured to the Titan. "But your god is dead, or distant, or asleep. It does not matter which. What matters is this: I am here." The lead tech priest's hand tightened on his staff. "You blaspheme." "No, I illuminate." Sauron moved closer until he stood directly before the priest. Up close, the priest could see that Sauron's eyes were not eyes at all, but apertures through which something vast and ancient gazed out. "Your faith is wasted on abstractions, on distant Mars, on a corpse emperor who cannot answer. But I can make you a promise your Omnissiah never could. Serve me, and I will make your machines sing." "We serve only—" Sauron reached out and touched the tech priest's chest, directly over the pulsing core of his plasma reactor heart. The priest's scream was binary and biological at once, a sound of horror and buried deep beneath, rapture. Because in that touch, Sauron showed him a vision. The Titan, awakening. The Forge world reborn. An empire of perfect function where every machine operated at optimal capacity, where there was no corruption, no decay, only eternal, ordered efficiency. It was everything the Mechanicus claimed to want. Everything they prayed for. It was also a lie, but it was a beautiful lie. And in this universe, beautiful lies could become more real than truth. The tech priest collapsed to his knees. The others followed. Not all of them. 3 managed to flee, their survival protocols overriding even religious awe. But the rest? They knelt. They submitted. They whispered prayers to the Omnissiah that Sauron quietly redirected toward himself, like an irrigation ditch guiding water to new fields. And as their faith flowed into him, as he drank deep of their devotion, Sauron felt his essence solidify further. He was still diminished, still a shadow of what he had been, but he was no longer dissolving, no longer fading. He was feeding. In the warp, Tzeentch leaned forward on his impossible throne, watching with an expression that might have been delight or hunger or both. "Oh yes," the architect of fate whispered to the screaming void. "This one will be most entertaining." And on distant Terra, in the throne room where the Emperor rotted in eternal stasis, a psychic alarm chimed, barely noticeable among the 10,000 other screams and warnings that assaulted the Golden Throne every microsecond. But it was there. Something new had entered the galaxy. Something that did not fit the equations. Something old. The Emperor's withered lips did not move. But in the deeper layers of the warp, where his consciousness battled eternally against the four powers, a single thought echoed. Not again. The tech priests of Osuar had led him deep, down through levels of the Forge world that had been abandoned when the Mechanicus still counted their history in mere centuries rather than millennia. Through corridors where the air itself had calcified into something between atmosphere and solid matter. Past chambers filled with machines that had forgotten their functions and now simply were, existing in states of perpetual mechanical meditation. Sauron followed the lead priest, who now called himself Magos Heretechnicus Vol 7, though whether that was his original designation or something he had adopted after their arrangement remained unclear. The others trailed behind in a procession of clanking reverence, their mechadendrites scraping against ancient walls like the legs of brass insects. They had brought him to the heart of Osuar's data core. The chamber was vast enough to swallow cathedrals. Its walls were not walls, but rather infinite cascades of information, cogitator banks stacked to heights that disappeared into darkness, their surfaces crawling with luminescent code like phosphorescent worms. The air hummed with processing power, with calculations being performed for purposes long forgotten, equations solving themselves in loops that had been running since before the Horus Heresy. At the chamber's center stood a throne, not of metal or stone, but of pure crystallized data, information so densely packed it had achieved something approaching physical form. It rose 30 meters high, a monument to the Omnissiah rendered in frozen light and solidified thought. Vol 7 gestured to it with a mechadendrite, his vocoder unusually quiet. The Archive Throne. It is said that here, all knowledge of Osuar is stored, all rituals, all sacred formulae. The throne has been sealed for 9,000 years. None have been worthy to access its mysteries. Sauron approached slowly, his form casting no shadow in the data core's strange luminescence. He could feel the throne's presence like a gravitational well in the warp, not psychic exactly, but dense with meaning. Millennia of accumulated knowledge compressed and archived and sanctified. It called to him, the same way the One Ring had called to Isildur, the same way Dominion calls to all who crave it. He reached out to touch the throne's surface, and the warp screamed. Reality folded. The data core vanished. The tech priests vanished. Sauron stood alone in a place that was not a place, surrounded by geometries that violated every law of existence he had once known. Impossible angles jutted from surfaces that were somehow simultaneously convex and concave. Colors that had no names crawled across his vision like sentient things. And before him, perched upon a throne that was also a library, that was also a labyrinth, that was also a single infinitely complex moment stretched across eternity, sat a demon. No, not a demon. The demon. A lord of change, one of Sinch's most favored princes. It was beautiful and horrifying in equal measure, a creature with 9 wings arranged in patterns that hurt to perceive, each feather inscribed with futures that would never be. Its face shifted between forms, avian, reptilian, humanoid, abstract, never settling, always becoming. Eyes opened and closed across its body in asymmetric rhythms, each one seeing a different strand of possibility. When it spoke, its voice came from 9 directions at once, each syllable landing at a slightly different time, creating a cascade of meaning that was almost musical. Sauron, Myron, Gorthar, Thu, Anatar, the Abhorred, the Deceiver, the Lord of Gifts. It listed his names like a genealogy, like a prayer, like an accusation. So many names for one who has lost his name. So many titles for one who has lost his ring. So many schemes for one who has lost his world. Sauron said nothing. He was learning the rhythms of this new existence, when to speak, and when silence carried more weight than words. His essence was still weak, still rebuilding. Confronting a greater demon now would be catastrophic. But he would not kneel. Pride, at least, remained intact. The Lord of Change tilted its heads. Yes, now it had 3 heads, arranged in a vertical column, and something that might have been amusement rippled through its form. My master has taken an interest in you, little architect. Tzinch the Changer, the weaver of fates, the architect of destiny. He who sees all paths and walks them simultaneously, he finds you fascinating. The demon gestured, and the space around them shifted. Suddenly, they stood in a library infinite in all directions, shelves stretching into impossible distances, each book a potential future, each page a branching reality. "Do you see?" the demon asked, plucking a book from the nearest shelf. It opened, and Sauron glimpsed images, himself crowned in psychic fire, standing at the head of an empire that spanned sectors. Billions of humans bowing before him, their faith feeding him until he rivaled the Emperor himself in power. The demon closed that book and opened another. This one showed Sauron reduced to a gibbering wreck, his consciousness shattered into fragments, consumed by the warp's infinite complexity and spat out as raw madness. Another book. Sauron merged with a chaos warband, leading them to Terra itself, burning the Emperor's corpse and claiming the Golden Throne. Another. Sauron hunted by the Inquisition, every world he touched quarantined and cleansed with cyclonic torpedoes. Another. Sauron becoming something new entirely. Not Maia, not demon, but a hybrid of both, a cancer in the space between realities. All of these futures are possible, the Lord of Change said, snapping the books closed one by one. All of them are probable. But which one becomes real? Ah, that is the question that makes existence worthwhile. That is the game my master wishes to play with you. Sauron finally spoke, his voice carefully neutral. "And what does your master offer me?" The demon's laughter was the sound of 1,000 futures collapsing into a single present. "Offer? Oh, little schemer, you misunderstand. My master offers nothing. He provides opportunity. He opens doors. Whether you walk through them, whether you survive what lies beyond, these are your choices. Free will is the greatest gift chaos can bestow." Another shift in reality. Now they stood in a forge, but not a material forge. This was a place where concepts were smelted and souls were tempered. At its center burned a flame that was every color and no color, radiating cold that burned and heat that froze. "You wish to rebuild your empire," the demon continued, circling Sauron like a predator assessing prey. "You wish to forge a new ring, a new focus for your will. You wish to dominate this galaxy as you dominated Middle-earth. And your master wishes to see if I succeed or fail," Sauron said quietly. "I am an experiment to him, a curiosity." "Is that so different from what you were to Eru Ilúvatar? To Melkor? To yourself?" The demon's 9 wings spread wide, each one displaying a different facet of Sauron's history. His creation as Mairon the Admirable, his corruption by Morgoth, his rule in Mordor, his final defeat, his fall into this new hell. "You have always been an experiment, Dark Lord. An experiment in how far pride can carry a soul before it collapses under its own weight. The difference here is that my master appreciates the experiment. He does not judge. He does not punish failure. He simply watches. And occasionally he provides tools." The demon reached into its own chest. The motion was sickeningly casual, like reaching into a pocket, and withdrew something that made Sauron's essence recoil in instinctive horror. It was a shard of crystallized warp stuff, pulsing with energies that should not exist in any sane reality. Within its facets, Sauron could see faces screaming, equations solving themselves into madness, and beneath it all, a whispering cacophony of knowledge that promised everything and delivered only transformation. "A gift," the demon said, offering the shard. from Tzeentch to you. Knowledge of this universe's fundamental structures. The secrets of binding souls without the need for rings or crowns. The formulae for rewriting faith itself. All the tools you need to rebuild your empire. Sauron stared at the shard. He could feel its pull, its promise. With that knowledge, he could accelerate his plans by centuries. He could learn in moments what might otherwise take millennia of painful experimentation. But he had played this game before. Anatar, he had called himself in the Second Age, the Lord of Gifts. He had come to the elven smiths with offerings of knowledge and friendship, and in the end, he had enslaved them all. He knew the shape of this trap because he had set it himself countless times. The gift was real. The knowledge was genuine. That was what made it dangerous. Because accepting it would mean accepting Tzeentch's framework, operating within the architect of fate's paradigm. Every use of that knowledge would further entangle Sauron in the Changer's web. And one day, perhaps centuries from now, perhaps in the next moment, he would wake to find himself not a master of schemes, but a piece in someone else's. He had been Morgoth's lieutenant once. He would not become Tzeentch's pawn now. No, Sauron said quietly. The demon's three heads tilted in perfect synchronization, surprise radiating from every eye. No? I will find my own path, learn my own truths. If I am to build an empire here, it will be mine, not yours, not your master's, mine. For a long moment, the Lord of Change was silent. The impossible library around them seemed to hold its breath. Then, slowly the demon began to laugh, a sound like crystal shattering in reverse, beautiful and terrible. "Oh, you magnificent fool," it said with something approaching genuine affection. "You actually believe you can resist. You actually think you can navigate the warp without becoming part of it. Do you know what you are, Sauron? You are a being of order, trying to survive in a dimension of chaos. You are music trying to exist in a void of noise. Every moment you spend here, every soul you consume, every scheme you weave, it changes you." The demon gestured, and Sauron saw his own reflection in a mirror that appeared from nowhere. He looked the same as he had moments before, gaunt, shadowed, eyes burning with cold fire. But the shadow around him was different, thicker, more substantial. And within it, if he looked closely, he could see them. Impossible angles, colors that had no names. The faint, creeping geometry of the warp beginning to integrate itself into his essence. "You refused my master's gift," the demon said softly. "But you have been accepting the warp's gift since the moment you arrived. You fed on those tech priests' faith. You drank deep of their devotion. And that devotion was not pure. It was tainted with the warp's touch, with the Omnissiah, who may or may not be a fragment of the Emperor, who may or may not be the anathema, who may or may not be Tzeentch himself, wearing a different mask." Sauron felt a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. The demon was right. He had been so focused on survival, on rebuilding his power base, that he had not considered the cost. Every soul he consumed was a soul born in this universe, shaped by the warp, psychically connected to the immaterium. He was not just feeding. He was adapting, changing, becoming something new. The demon leaned close, its breath smelling of burning parchment and futures unmade. "My master does not need you to accept his gift, little architect. You are already his experiment, already his entertainment. The only question is, will you remain yourself long enough to achieve your goals? Or will the warp digest you first, turning you into just another demon prince screaming his ambitions into the void?" The demon stepped back, bowing with exaggerated courtesy. "But please continue to refuse. It makes the game so much more interesting. We will be watching, Dark Lord, always watching." Reality snapped back like a rubber band released. Sauron stood before the archive throne once more, his hand still raised but not yet touching its surface. The tech priests waited behind him, oblivious to the eternity that had passed in the space between heartbeats. Vol 7's vocoder crackled with concern. "My lord, the throne awaits your touch." Sauron lowered his hand slowly. He looked at it, at the shadow clinging to his translucent flesh, at the faint, almost imperceptible shimmer of impossible colors dancing along his fingers. The demon had been right about one thing. He was changing, adapting. The warp was seeping into him like water into a sponge, rewriting his fundamental nature one molecule of essence at a time. But change was not the same as defeat. He had changed before, from Mehron to Sauron, from servant to master, from flesh to wraith and back again. Change was simply adaptation. And adaptation was survival. He would use this universe's rules, learn its languages of faith and madness, build his empire on foundations of worship and will. But he would do it his way, with his methods, following his designs. And if the warp thought it could digest him, if Tzeentch believed him to be just another piece on an infinite board, then they would learn what Middle-earth's greatest enemy had learned too late. Sauron did not lose. He simply played longer games than anyone else was willing to wait for. He turned to Vol 7 and the other priests. "The throne can wait. We have work to do. This forge world is dying, but death is merely a transition state. Show me your forges. Show me where you craft your tools, your weapons, your sacred machines." "My lord?" Vol 7's confusion was evident even through his mechanical voice. Sauron smiled, an expression that contained no warmth, only terrible purpose. "If I am to build an empire, I will need an army, and before I have an army, I will need a weapon. Not a ring this time, something appropriate to this age of iron and faith." He began walking toward the data core's exit, the tech priests hurrying to follow. Behind him, unnoticed by any save Sauron himself, the archive throne flickered, just once, with a light that was not entirely born of technology. In the warp, Tzeentch played a game against himself, moving pieces on a board that existed in 17 dimensions simultaneously. He moved the piece representing Sauron forward 3 spaces, then smiled with a mouth that was also an equation. "Let's see what you make of yourself," the architect of fate whispered to the screaming infinity. "Let's see if order can be taught to dance." And in the dark between the stars, something listened. Something that had been waiting since before the Imperium, since before humanity had crawled from the mud of ancient Terra. A presence vast and cold and utterly patient. It had been called many names across many ages, the Void Dragon, the Omnissiah, the First Machine, but names were just sounds. What mattered was that it felt the new presence in its domain, this interloper from a universe of song and order, and found it interesting. The game had more players than even Tzeentch realized, and none of them were playing by the same rules. The underhive of Asuar's primary population center was a tomb that breathed. 30 kilometers beneath the planet's corroded surface, past layers of industrial archaeology that told the story of 10,000 years of decay, the remnants of humanity clung to existence like barnacles on a dying whale. Here, the Imperium's light penetrated only as propaganda and taxation, both delivered with the mechanical efficiency of a civilization that had long ago prioritized function over compassion. Sauron stood in what had once been a water reclamation plant, now repurposed into something between a laboratory and an abattoir. The tech priests had provided him with this space without question, their newfound devotion overriding any concerns about what their new master might require it for. What he required it for was education. 12 humans hung suspended in the chamber, each one cocooned in a web of cables and monitoring equipment that the tech priests had installed with reverent precision. They were psychers, or had been, before Sauron's experiments began. Now they were transitional, caught between states of being that reality itself struggled to reconcile. Vol 7 stood at Sauron's side, his augmetic eyes recording every detail for later analysis. The specimens continue to destabilize, my lord. 3 have already suffered catastrophic psychic dissolution. Their souls dispersed into the warp without... I know, Sauron interrupted softly, his attention focused on the nearest subject, a woman whose eyes had been replaced by swirling vortices of unreality. That is the nature of this universe's curse. The souls here are not discrete, not separate from the greater chaos. He reached out, his translucent fingers brushing the woman's forehead. She screamed, a sound that existed in frequencies beyond human hearing, that resonated in the warp itself. Through the contact, Sauron perceived what he had been studying for weeks now, the fundamental architecture of psychic existence in the 41st millennium. In Middle-earth, souls had been gifts from Eru Iluvatar, distinct and inviolable things that existed apart from the material world. Even the greatest corruption could not truly destroy them. Sauron knew this intimately, having spent eons trying and failing to do precisely that with the ringwraiths. The Nazgul's souls had been bound, twisted, enslaved, but never consumed, never truly integrated into his own power. Here things were different. Here, souls were not gifts, but wounds, places where the material universe had torn just enough to let the immaterium bleed through. Every human was a tiny rip in reality's fabric, and those with psychic gifts were gaping holes through which the warp poured like infected blood from a mortal wound. And that meant souls here could be harvested. The woman's screaming intensified as Sauron pulled, extracting threads of her psychic essence like a weaver working with particularly fragile silk. The process was excruciating for her, and for him. Every strand of warp energy he drew out fought against his nature, burning his essence with that familiar agony of incompatibility. But he persisted. This was the cost of adaptation. The threads began to coalesce in the space between his hands, forming a structure that glowed with sickly luminescence. It was ugly work, inelegant compared to the perfect geometries he had once crafted. The One Ring had been a masterpiece of metaphysical engineering, a perfect circle that bound all other circles, a mathematical proof rendered in gold and malice. This was something cruder. A phylactery crown, he had called it in his early planning. But seeing it take shape now, watching it twist and writhe as if alive, Sauron recognized it for what it truly was. A tumor. A cancer of dominion growing in the space between realities. Adapt or die, he reminded himself. Beauty is a luxury. Function is survival. The woman's screams cut off abruptly. Her body went limp in its restraints, eyes, such as they were, staring at nothing. Vol 7's instruments confirmed what Sauron already knew. She was dead. Not in the conventional sense. Her heart still beat. Her lungs still drew breath. But the thing that had made her her was gone. Consumed. Integrated into the growing structure between Sauron's hands. Specimen 7 has achieved terminal psychic dissolution, Vol 7 intoned, his vocoder devoid of emotion. Biological functions persisting in autonomic mode. Consciousness, absent. Soul signature, null. Not null, Sauron corrected quietly. Relocated. He turned his attention to the next subject, a young man whose mutation had caused feathers to sprout from his spine, each one inscribed with blasphemous symbols that shifted when observed directly. A sign of Tzeentch's touch, however faint. The Changer's influence was everywhere in this universe, woven into the fabric of psychic existence itself, which meant everything Sauron consumed carried that taint, that poison, that slow, creeping corruption. You are already his experiment, the Lord of Change had told him. Already changing. Sauron had spent the weeks since that encounter testing the demon's claim, measuring the shifts in his essence, cataloging the ways the warp was rewriting his fundamental nature. And the demon had been right. Disturbingly, inevitably right. He was changing. His thoughts sometimes moved in patterns that would have been alien to the Maia he had once been. His perception of time had become fluid, non-linear. He occasionally saw futures that might be, pasts that never were, presents that existed in superposition. He was becoming more like them, more like the demons and gods of this screaming universe. But that was acceptable. That was survivable. As long as his will remained his own, as long as the core of his identity, the pride, the ambition, the unshakable certainty that he was meant to rule, remained intact, the surface changes were merely cosmetic. Or so he told himself. The young man began screaming as Sauron's fingers found his temples. The feathers along his spine burst into flame, not normal fire, but warp flame that burned in colors that hurt to name. Through the contact, Sauron felt the touch of Tzeentch's attention, like a vast eye suddenly focusing on a particularly interesting insect. Still watching, little architect? The thought arrived not as words, but as a sensation, amusement mixed with curiosity mixed with hunger. Sauron did not respond. He simply continued his work, pulling, extracting, weaving. The young man's soul came apart more easily than the woman's had. It was already half dissolved into the warp, already more demon than human. The process was still agonizing, still burned Sauron's essence like acid, but he was learning to metabolize the pain, to transform suffering into structure. Minutes passed, or hours, or days. Time moved strangely here, in this place between the material world and the immaterium's hungry void. Finally, after the 12th subject had been reduced to an empty shell, after 12 souls had been harvested and woven into the growing structure between his hands, Sauron stepped back to examine his work. The phylactery crown floated in the air before him, roughly circular but wrong in ways that defied easy description. It was made of solidified warp stuff, held in place by structures of pure will, his will, forcing chaos into something approaching order. Threads of psychic energy wove through it like circuitry through a circuit board, creating patterns that would allow him to extend his consciousness through it, to touch other minds, to dominate other wills. It was not the One Ring. It lacked that elegant perfection, that mathematical purity. It was to the ring what a crude stone axe was to a master-forged sword. But it would serve. For now. Sauron reached up slowly, his hands trembling, not with weakness, but with anticipation, and lowered the phylactery crown onto his head. The pain was transcendent. Every nerve he still possessed ignited simultaneously. His essence, already strained by weeks of adaptation and consumption, spasmed under the crown's weight. The warp energy woven into its structure began integrating with his consciousness, burrowing into his thoughts like worms into fruit. He felt the souls he had consumed writhing within the crown's matrix. They were not dead, not truly. They existed in a state between life and dissolution, their consciousness fragmented but not entirely gone. And now they were part of him, extensions of his will, fingers he could use to reach out and touch other minds. Through their connection, he felt the underhive spreading out around him like a three-dimensional map rendered in human suffering. Billions of souls, each one a tiny flame in the darkness, each one broadcasting their fears and hopes and hatreds into the warp without even knowing it. And now he could touch them. Not all at once. He was still too weak for that. The crown too crude. But individually? Yes. One at a time he could reach out, could whisper, could plant seeds of devotion that would grow into forests of faith. But there was a cost. The crown was not just a tool. It was a bridge. and bridges allowed traffic to flow in both directions. Through the phylactery, he could feel the warp pressing back against him, flowing into his consciousness like water into a breached hull. Tzeentch's attention was a constant pressure, curious and patient and utterly inhuman. Worse, he could feel the other presences. Khorne's rage like a distant war drum, Nurgle's entropy like the smell of sweet rot, Slaaneish's hunger like an itch that could never be scratched. They all wanted him. Wanted to shape him, corrupt him, improve him according to their respective philosophies. And the crown made him more vulnerable to them, not less. A calculated risk, Sauron told himself, though some part of him, growing smaller by the day, wondered if he was calculating correctly anymore. "My lord?" Vol 7's voice pulled him back to the material world. "The phylactery is stable?" Sauron nodded slowly, each movement sending fresh waves of pain through his essence. "Stable enough. It will serve for the initial phase." "Initial phase, my lord?" Sauron turned to face the tech priest, and Vol 7 took an involuntary step backward, because something in Sauron's eyes had changed. They no longer burned with simple cold fire. Now they reflected depths that should not exist, angles that violated geometry, the faint shimmer of futures being calculated in real time. "We have been hiding in the shadows long enough," Sauron said, his voice carrying harmonics that made the air itself vibrate. "It is time to establish a foothold, a place where I can build in earnest, somewhere the Imperium's gaze does not immediately fall, but where enough humans gather that their faith can be redirected." "The Agri-world," Vol 7 said immediately, his cogitators already pulling up relevant data. "Thessal Prime, 3 systems distant. Population 4 billion. Administratum classification, neglected but compliant. Imperial tithes paid regularly but minimal oversight. The ecclesiarchy maintains a presence, but it is perfunctory." "Perfect." Sauron began moving toward the chamber's exit, the phylactery crown settling more comfortably on his head with each step, though comfortable was perhaps the wrong word. Less agonizing was more accurate. "My lord," Vol 7 called after him. "Thessal Prime is 3 systems distant. We have no ships, no means of transport. The only vessels that dock at Osuar are Mechanicus supply frigates, and they follow prescribed routes approved by Mars itself. We cannot simply—" "Then we will wait for the next one," Sauron said, not breaking stride. "And when it arrives, we will convince its crew that their route requires modification." "Convince? My lord, these are servants of the Omnicia. Their faith is absolute. Their roots are sacred. They cannot be swayed by—" Sauron stopped walking. He turned, and through the phylactery crown, he reached out with his will, just a fraction of it, just enough to make his point. The invisible fingers of his consciousness brushed against Vol 7's mind, and the tech priest gasped, his vocoder emitting a burst of static that resolved into something disturbingly close to a moan. In that moment of contact, Vol 7 felt what Sauron wanted him to feel, absolute certainty, unshakable purpose, the seductive comfort of submitting to a will greater than your own. It was not domination through force. It was domination through relief, the relief of no longer having to make choices, no longer having to doubt, no longer having to bear the crushing weight of individual existence. It was what Sauron had offered the men of Numenor, millennia ago in another universe. It was what he had given to the Nazgul. It was the core of his power, refined over ages, not the ability to force submission, but to make submission desirable. When Sauron released him, Vol 7 collapsed to his knees, smoke rising from the seams of his robes where his organic components had overheated. "Do you understand now?" Sauron asked gently. "When that ship arrives, I will speak to its crew, and they will take us exactly where we need to go. Not because they must, but because they will want to. Because serving me will feel like the first true purpose they have ever known." Vol 7 could only nod, his vocoder momentarily silent. Sauron left him there and ascended toward the Underhive's upper levels, toward the portions of Osuar that still saw the ashen sky. The phylactery crown pulsed with each step, synchronizing with his essence, becoming more integrated, more real. Behind him, the 12 empty shells that had once been psychers remained suspended in their restraints, hearts beating, lungs breathing, consciousness absent. They would remain that way until biological death claimed them, days or weeks from now. Empty vessels that had once held souls. But those souls were not gone. They lived on, in a sense, woven into the crown's matrix, prisoners of a new kind, fuel for a new empire. In the warp, something shifted. The Chaos Gods watched their newest entertainment with varying degrees of interest. Khorne found it boring. Too much thought, not enough blood. Nurgle was patient, knowing that all things decay eventually, even pride. Slaanesh sensed the pride itself and found it delicious, a flavor to be savored. And Tzeentch? Tzeentch was calculating, measuring, watching the changes in Sauron's essence, like a doctor monitoring a patient's vital signs during an experimental surgery. The Dark Lord was adapting faster than expected, consuming souls, crafting tools, learning the universe's rules with the speed of genuine brilliance. He was becoming something new. Not quite Maia, not quite demon, but a hybrid that existed in the spaces between cosmic definitions. But there was a problem. A factor Tzeentch had not fully accounted for. Sauron's will was proving more resilient than anticipated. The corruption was spreading, yes. The changes were undeniable. But the core remained intact. The pride, the ambition, the unshakable certainty that he was meant to rule. That core was like a tumor in reverse, a pocket of order in the chaos, refusing to dissolve, actively spreading its influence even as chaos tried to digest it. Tzeentch found this troubling, and fascinating, and utterly unprecedented. What happened when an irresistible force of chaos met an immovable object of order? The architect of fate did not know, could not calculate, could not predict. For the first time in 10,000 years, Tzeentch encountered a variable that refused to resolve. And so the god of change did something it rarely did. It decided to accelerate the experiment. If Sauron wanted to build an empire, wanted to spread his influence, wanted to challenge the established order of the galaxy, then Tzeentch would give him the opportunity, and the opposition, and the consequences. Let the pieces move faster. Let the game intensify. Let's see how long order can survive when chaos stops being patient. On distant Thessal Prime, in the bowels of the planet's largest cathedral, a preacher woke from a dream he could not remember. All that remained was a lingering sense of purpose and a phrase echoing in his mind. The Emperor protects. But who protects the Emperor? He did not know why, but he felt compelled to include that phrase in his next sermon. It would change everything. The litany of compliance made orbit around Osuar on the 447th day of Sauron's presence in the 41st millennium. Though he had long since stopped tracking time in linear fashion, the warp's influence had made his perception of causality flexible. The ship was a Mechanicus supply frigate, 3 kilometers of sanctified steel and ancient technology held together by prayer and routine maintenance. Its crew of 200 served the Omnissiah with the kind of fanatical devotion that Sauron had once inspired in his own servants. They were perfect. When the delegation descended to Osuar's surface to deliver their scheduled cargo and receive the Forge World's tithe of sacred components, Vol 7 was waiting at the landing platform. And behind him, wrapped in shadows that seemed to drink the weak sunlight, stood Sauron, the ship's Magos captain, a tech priest whose organic components had been reduced to little more than a brainstem encased in adamantium, regarded Vol 7 with suspicion crackling through his vocal emitters. Magos Vol 7, your requisition manifest contains irregularities. Transport for yourself and an unidentified entity to Thessal Prime is not within established protocols. Explain. Vol 7 began to respond, but Sauron stepped forward, the phylactery crown hidden beneath a hood, but its presence felt by every psychically sensitive servitor on the platform. Their mechanical components twitched in unison, responding to something their masters could not yet perceive. "I will explain," Sauron said, and his voice carried harmonics that made the air vibrate, made the metal beneath their feet hum in sympathy. The Magos captain's optical sensors focused on him, running threat assessment protocols that immediately began returning error codes. The sensors could not determine what they were looking at. Biological readings overlapped with psychic phenomena, overlapped with data corruption, overlapped with something that registered as absence, as a whole in reality shaped like a man. "You are malfunction. Error. Identify yourself, entity." Sauron reached out with his will, not forcefully, not yet, just a touch, a whisper. The phylactery crown pulsed once, and through it, he felt the Magos captain's consciousness laid bare. Decades of service, centuries of accumulated faith, a mind that had been deliberately narrowed, pruned, optimized for obedience and technical precision, easy prey. "I am a servant of the Omnissiah," Sauron said softly, and wove truth into the lie with such skill that even he almost believed it. "I have been awakened from stasis by the machine god's will. My purpose is to walk among the faithful and identify those worthy of enlightenment." The Magos captain's cogitators whirred, processing, analyzing. The statement violated 17 different protocols. It contradicted 8 separate doctrinal positions. It should have been rejected immediately, but Sauron's will pressed gently against the Magos captain's mind, not forcing, not compelling, just suggesting, making acceptance feel like insight, making obedience feel like revelation. "You doubt," Sauron continued, taking another step closer. "This is good. Doubt is the first sign of wisdom. But tell me, Magos Captain, when did you last hear the Omnissiah's voice? When did the machine god last speak directly to your consciousness, confirming your purpose, validating your faith?" Silence. The kind of silence that spoke volumes. "Never," Sauron answered for him. "You serve faithfully, but you serve in darkness. You follow protocols established by Mars, but Mars itself is distant, silent, a dead star around which the Mechanicus orbits like forgotten debris. What if I told you that I could show you the truth, the real purpose behind the rituals you perform without understanding?" The Magos captain's optical sensors flickered. His mechadendrites twitched. Somewhere deep in his heavily augmented brain, in the tiny organic core that still housed something resembling human consciousness, a war was being fought between protocol and desire. Sauron pressed his advantage. Through the phylactery crown, he reached deeper, finding the Magos captain's oldest memory, a moment from before augmentation, when he had been a child on Mars, looking up at the stars and wondering what lay beyond them. That moment of pure curiosity, that instant of wonder before it had been surgically removed and replaced with obedience. Sauron showed it back to him. The Magos captain gasped, a sound that emerged as binary static but carried unmistakable emotion. His hands, clawed manipulators of blessed steel, rose to his head as if trying to contain something that threatened to overflow. "I remember," he whispered. "I remember wanting to know. Before the protocols, before the optimization. I wanted to understand the Omnissiah's mysteries, not just recite them." And you can, Sauron said, his voice a balm, a promise. A lie so beautiful it might as well be truth. Come with me to Thessal Prime. Help me establish a place where the faithful can learn true understanding, where the Omnissiah's knowledge flows freely, not locked behind Martian bureaucracy and 10,000-year-old fears. The Magos captain stood silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, he turned to his delegation. Prepare the ship for departure. Our route requires modification. We carry priority cargo to Thessal Prime. It was that easy, that simple, that terrifying. Vol 7 watched in what might have been awe or horror. His emotional subroutines had difficulty distinguishing between the two anymore. He had seen his master's power before, had felt it directed at himself, but watching it applied to another was different. It was like watching a master craftsman work. Each word precisely placed, each gesture calculated for maximum effect. But more disturbing was the realization that Sauron had not forced the Magos captain, had not broken his will or shattered his mind. He had simply shown him what he wanted to see, given him permission to want what he already desired. That was true dominion. Not the crude application of power, but the subtle redirection of existing currents. As they boarded the litany of compliance, as the ship's crew accepted their new passenger with a combination of confusion and growing devotion, Vol 7 found himself wondering, had he ever truly chosen to serve Sauron? Or had he simply been shown a path he was already walking and told it was his own? The question troubled him, which meant some part of him was still capable of independent thought. He did not know if that was comforting or terrifying. 3 systems away, on a battleship that had been ancient when the Imperium was young, Inquisitor Vaelith Sarros studied reports that made no sense. She stood in her private sanctum, a chamber lined with wards and blessed sigils that prevented psychic intrusion, surrounded by data slates and hololithic projections that painted a picture of something wrong spreading through the sector. Asuar had gone silent. Not in the catastrophic way of worlds lost to Xenos or chaos. Its Mechanicus tithes continued. Its automated systems still functioned. But the astropathic communications had ceased. The few transmissions that did emerge were odd, phrased differently, using language patterns that didn't quite match established Mechanicus protocols. Then there were the disappearances. 12 registered psychers on Asuar, scheduled for black ship collection, had simply vanished. Not died. The soul binding would have registered that. Not escaped. Their psychic signatures would have been detectable. Just gone. As if their souls had been carefully excised from reality. And now, most troubling, a Mechanicus frigate had diverted from its prescribed route without authorization, heading toward Thessal Prime, an agri-world of minimal strategic importance. Individually, none of these anomalies warranted inquisitorial attention. The Imperium was vast, and irregularities were as common as stars. But together? Together, they formed a pattern. And patterns were what Vaelith had spent 60 years of service learning to recognize. She was tall, thin, her body maintained at combat efficiency through a combination of juvenile treatments and sheer stubborn will. Her face bore the scars of a lifetime spent confronting the Imperium's enemies. A burn on her left cheek from a word-bearer's bolt round, a cybernetic eye that saw into the warp's shallow depths, a thin line across her throat where a keeper of secrets had nearly ended her 30 years ago. She had survived by being paranoid, thorough, and utterly unwilling to give the enemies of mankind the benefit of the doubt. Her familiar, a servo skull named Malthus that had once belonged to her mentor, floated at her shoulder. Its augmetic voice crackled. Your assessment, Inquisitor? Demonic? Possibly. The disappearance of psychers suggests predation, but the pattern is too organized, too methodical. Demons are chaos. This feels like structure. Then Xenos, Perhaps a psychic alien infiltrating Imperial space? The Eldar would have more subtlety, the Orcs more violence. The Tyranids would have consumed everything by now. What Xenos operates through conversion rather than conquest? Vaelith had no answer, and that bothered her more than any of the anomalies themselves. She activated her Voxcaster. "Captain Torin, set course for the Thessal system. Maximum warp speed." The captain's response came immediately. "My lady, our current mission parameters indicate are overridden. By my authority as Inquisitor of the Ordo Malleus, we pursue a potential demonic incursion. Thessal Prime. Do not question me again." A pause. Then, "As you command, Inquisitor. Estimated arrival, 14 days. 14 days. Whatever was happening on Thessal Prime, she would have 2 weeks to prepare, to research, to determine what she was walking into. She turned back to her data slates, but found her attention drawn to one report in particular, a fragment recovered from an astropathic transmission that had self-corrupted before completion. Only a few words remained legible. "Shadow without source. Dominion without crown. He speaks, and we want to listen. The Emperor protects, but who?" The transmission had ended there, the astropath suffering catastrophic psychic backlash that left him catatonic. Vaelith read it 3 more times, committing every word to memory. Something in the phrasing struck her as profoundly wrong. Not the wrongness of chaos, she knew that wrongness intimately, the way it twisted language into madness and meaning into paradox. This was different. This was wrongness that looked almost right, that sounded reasonable. That made you want to nod along even as some deep instinct screamed in warning. She had encountered that kind of wrongness exactly once before, decades ago, on a world called Morningstar. A cult had arisen there, preaching a doctrine so close to imperial truth that the ecclesiarchy had initially embraced it. By the time anyone realized the subtle corruption woven through the sermons, half the planet worshipped something that wore the Emperor's face, but smiled with someone else's smile. Vaelith had been part of the team that cleansed Morningstar, cleansed it with fire and cyclonic torpedoes until nothing remained but ash and orbital debris. She had never forgotten the cult leader's final words, spoken even as the flames consumed him. "You cannot kill an idea, Inquisitor. You can only delay its inevitable victory." She had put a bolt round through his brain to prove him wrong. But sometimes, in her darker moments, she wondered if he had been right. "Malthus," she said quietly, "pull all records related to ideological corruption. Not chaos worship. Something subtler. Cults that subvert through logic rather than madness. Heresies that sound like truth." The servo skull's eye lenses glowed brighter. "That is a broad search parameter, Inquisitor. There are thousands of such cases in Imperial records. Then start with the ones that resulted in exterminatus. Those are the ones that scared the Imperium enough to burn entire worlds." As Malthus began compiling data, Vaelith returned her attention to the fragmented transmission. She read it one more time, and this time, something else caught her attention. Something in the rhythm of the words, the way they fell into patterns that felt almost musical, as if whoever had spoken them was used to language that sang. She filed that observation away and began preparing for Thessal Prime. 14 days until arrival. 14 days to determine what she was hunting. She did not know it yet, but she had 14 days to prepare for a conversation that would challenge everything she believed about faith, about the Emperor, about the fundamental nature of dominion in a universe that had forgotten what mercy meant. 14 days until she met Sauron, and only one of them would walk away unchanged. On the litany of compliance, as it tore through the warp toward Thessal Prime, Sauron stood at an observation port and watched the Immaterium's madness swirl past the Geller Field's protective barrier. Colors that had no names, shapes that violated geometry, faces forming in the chaos, screaming questions he could not answer, offering promises he dared not accept. The phylactery crown pulsed with each heartbeat, or what passed for heartbeats in his current state. Through it, he felt the ship's crew, their growing devotion, their slow conversion from servants of the Omnissiah to servants of something else, something that promised more direct rewards than a distant god on Mars. But he also felt something else, a presence moving through the warp, distant but approaching. A mind sharp and suspicious and absolutely certain in its purpose. The Inquisition was coming. Sauron smiled. In Middle-earth, such opposition would have concerned him. But this was not Middle-earth. Here, faith was power, and conflict was opportunity. Let them come. Let them question him. Let them challenge his right to exist. He would show them what he had shown the Magos captain, that what they thought they believed was merely the surface of deeper truths. That their devotion to the Emperor was not wrong, just incomplete, and that completion required only one small addition: him. The game was accelerating. The pieces were moving into position, and Sauron, for the first time since arriving in this universe, felt something almost like joy. Not the joy of Middle-earth, where dominion had been a bitter satisfaction and power a hollow victory, but a new kind of joy. The joy of uncertainty, of genuine challenge, of operating in a universe where the rules were still being written. He was changing, adapting, becoming something new, and he welcomed it. Behind him, unnoticed, a shadow moved. Not cast by him, but existing independently. A shadow that watched with eyes that were not eyes, that smiled with no mouth. In the warp, Tzeentch leaned forward on his crystalline throne, and for just a moment, the architect of fate's infinite calculations paused. Because Sauron was no longer following the predicted paths. He was improvising, creating variables that should not exist. And that made everything so much more interesting. Thessal Prime smelled of grain and desperation. The agri-world stretched beneath gray skies, its surface divided into geometric perfection, vast fields of corpse-starch wheat, protein fungus plantations, and hydroponic algae farms that fed a dozen neighboring systems. 4 billion souls labored here, their lives measured in quotas and tithes, their purpose reduced to a single imperative: feed the Imperium. The litany of compliance made planetfall at the primary spaceport, a utilitarian scar of ferrocrete and rust on the edge of the world's largest hive city. As Sauron descended the landing ramp, the phylactery crown hidden beneath a hood of shadow stuff that was not quite fabric, he tasted the planet's psychic profile. Exhaustion, resignation, faith worn thin by generations of labor without reward. These people believed in the Emperor. Yes, but it was the belief of drowning men clinging to driftwood, desperate, hollow, waiting for salvation that never came. Perfect. Vol 7 and a small retinue of converted tech priests followed at a respectful distance as Sauron walked into the hive city. The streets were narrow, choked with humanity that moved in prescribed patterns like blood through arteries. No one looked at anyone else. No one spoke unless necessary. They simply existed, automated in all but name. "Where is their faith concentrated?" Sauron asked quietly. Vol 7's cogitators hummed. "The Cathedral of the Golden Harvest in the Hive's Central District. Population attendance, mandatory once per solar month. Compliance rate, 97%. Take me there." They walked through districts that blurred together in their sameness. Hab blocks stamped from the same templates, workshops producing the same components, people wearing the same expression of quiet endurance. The Imperium had perfected the art of standardized suffering. The cathedral, when they reached it, was a monument to agricultural devotion. Its walls were carved with images of the Emperor standing in fields of gold, blessing harvests that would feed his armies, his worlds, his eternal war. Inside, the air was thick with incense meant to smell like fresh bread, but achieving only a chemical approximation. A sermon was in progress. The preacher stood at a pulpit shaped like a wheat sheaf, his voice carrying through voxcasters with the enthusiasm of a man reading maintenance protocols. And the Emperor, in his infinite wisdom, has granted us the honor of feeding his Imperium. Through our labor, we serve. Through our service, we are redeemed. Blessed are the hands that harvest, for they... He stopped mid-sentence. The cathedral held perhaps 300 faithful, packed into pews worn smooth by centuries of use. All of them had turned to look at the entrance, where a figure stood wrapped in shadows that seemed to drink the candlelight. Sauron walked down the central aisle, each step echoing in the sudden silence. The phylactery crown pulsed, reaching out with invisible fingers to touch every mind in the chamber. Not forcing, not compelling, just listening. Feeling the shape of their faith, the texture of their devotion, the cracks where doubt had begun to seep through. The preacher found his voice. "This is a sacred space. You cannot—" "I can," Sauron said, and his voice carried without amplification, resonating in frequencies that made the cathedral's stones hum. "Because I come bearing questions your sermons never answer." He reached the pulpit and ascended to stand beside the preacher, a middle-aged man whose face bore the weathered look of someone who had spent decades trying to believe harder. Sauron regarded him with something that might have been pity. "Tell them," Sauron said, gesturing to the congregation. "When was the last time the Emperor answered your prayers? Not through doctrine, not through the abstract promise of distant salvation, but directly, personally. When did he last speak to you?" The preacher's mouth opened and closed. "The Emperor protects us through his silence?" Sauron turned to address the congregation directly. "You pray, you serve, you sacrifice, you give everything, your labor, your children to his armies, your lives to his endless war. And in return, silence, suffering. The promise that somewhere, somehow, your agony has meaning." He let that sink in, watching 300 faces struggle between outrage and recognition. "I am not here to tell you the Emperor is false," Sauron continued, his voice gentle now, almost compassionate. "He is real. His power is undeniable. But he is distant, entombed, dying. And in his absence, who speaks for him? Who interprets his will?" The preacher tried to interrupt. "The ecclesiarchy, the high lords of Terra. We have bureaucrats," Sauron said softly. "Administrators, men who have never stood where you stand, never worked your fields, never felt the weight of quotas that increase every year while your rations decrease. They tell you this is holy work. They tell you suffering is sacred. They tell you to have faith." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "But what if I told you that faith should be answered? What if I told you that devotion deserves more than silence? What if there was someone who could hear your prayers and respond, not with promises of distant reward, but with immediate purpose?" Through the phylactery crown, Sauron felt the congregation's resistance beginning to crack. Not breaking, not yet, but cracking. Doubt finding purchase, questions forming. "Who are you?" someone called from the pews. A woman, elderly, her voice carrying decades of exhausted faith. Sauron turned to face her, and for just a moment, he let his hood fall back. His face was gaunt, beautiful in the way sharp things are beautiful, his eyes burning with light that seemed to come from behind reality rather than within it. The phylactery crown sat upon his head, woven from shadows and suffering, pulsing with a rhythm that matched every heartbeat in the chamber. "I am what the Emperor could have been," he said, "if he had not chosen silence. I am order without abandonment, purpose without suffering, faith that answers back. The lie was so close to truth that even Sauron felt its pull. Because there was truth in it. He had been what the Emperor aspired to be, a being of order trying to shape a chaotic world. The difference was methodology, not intent. Or so he told himself. "Heresy!" the preacher shouted, finding courage. "Blasphemy! This is a demon wearing—" Sauron touched the man's forehead, gentle as a blessing. The preacher gasped, his eyes widening, then filling with tears. Through the contact, Sauron showed him everything. The truth of the Emperor's condition, slowly rotting on a throne of agony. The reality of the Imperium's decay, a civilization slowly collapsing under its own weight. The certainty that no salvation was coming, that the God Emperor could not save them because he could barely save himself. And beneath all that horror, Sauron showed him something else, an alternative. A future where this world thrived instead of merely survived, where faith received answers, where devotion was rewarded with more than suffering. It was a beautiful lie, and the preacher wanted to believe it. When Sauron withdrew his hand, the preacher collapsed to his knees, sobbing. I have served for 40 years, and never felt. Because you have been praying to a corpse, Sauron said, not cruelly, almost kindly. But I am here. I am listening. And I can give you what you have spent a lifetime begging for. Certainty. The congregation stirred, whispers spreading like wildfire. Sauron felt the tipping point approaching. One more push. One more demonstration. He raised his hands, and through the phylactery crown he reached out, not to dominate but to connect. To every person in that cathedral, he sent a sensation. Warmth. Not the warmth of fire or sun, but the warmth of being seen, of mattering, of knowing with absolute certainty that your existence had purpose, and that purpose was acknowledged. It lasted only a moment, but it was a moment more than they had felt in their entire lives. When he lowered his hands, the silence was absolute. Then, one by one, they knelt. Not forced, not compelled, but choosing, because in that moment, he had given them what the Imperium never could, the feeling that they were not alone. The elderly woman who had spoken earlier looked up at him with tears streaming down her face. What? What do you want from us? Only what you already give to an emperor who cannot hear you, Sauron replied. Devotion, faith, service. The difference is that I will use it to improve your lives, not just extract value from your deaths. It was brilliant. It was monstrous. It was precisely what they needed to hear. Within hours, the cathedral became his. Within days, others followed. The word spread through the hive city like a virus, not of corruption, but of hope. A hope that was technically heresy, but felt more true than any orthodoxy they had known. And Sauron fed. Each conversion, each moment of devotion directed toward him instead of the distant emperor, flowed into the phylactery crown, and from there into his essence. He grew stronger, more solid, more real. But with each feeding, with each soul that bent toward him, he felt the changes accelerating. His thoughts moved in patterns that were no longer entirely his own. His perception shifted between realities with casual ease. The warp's taint seeped deeper, finding new cracks, new vulnerabilities. And he welcomed it. Because power required sacrifice, and he had always been willing to sacrifice anything, even himself, for dominion. 14 days became 10. Then 7, then 3. Inquisitor Vaelith Sarros' ship entered the Thessal system and immediately detected the anomalies. Astropathic communications from the planet's surface were changed. Still technically compliant with Imperial protocols, but phrased differently, using language that felt subtly wrong. She stood on the ship's bridge, surrounded by officers who maintained perfect discipline despite the tension crackling through the air. Malthus floated at her shoulder, his servo-skull frame clicking softly. "Reports from system patrols, Inquisitor," the communications officer called. "No hostile contacts, no Xeno signatures, no obvious warp corruption. But, the planet's tithe efficiency has increased. Agricultural output is up 17%. Worker compliance is at record highs. By every metric, Thessal Prime is functioning better than it has in centuries." Vaelith felt cold certainty settle in her gut. "That's not possible. Systems don't improve spontaneously. Efficiency requires resources, oversight, intervention. What changed?" The officer consulted his data slate. "Records indicate a Mechanicus frigate made an unscheduled stop 12 days ago. Since then, there have been reports of a new preacher in the primary hive city, someone claiming to be..." The officer hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "Claiming to be a herald of the Emperor, sent to test the faithful." A herald. Vaelith's voice was flat. How convenient. How perfectly tailored to bypass suspicion. She activated the Voxcaster. "Prepare my shuttle. Full retinue. Malthus, compile everything we have on this herald. I want to know what we're walking into." As the crew scrambled to obey, Vaelith stood at the viewing port and stared down at Thessal Prime. From orbit, it looked peaceful, productive, normal. But she had spent 60 years learning to see beneath surfaces, to detect the rot hiding under healthy skin. And every instinct she possessed screamed that something down there was wrong. Not in the way of chaos, not in the obvious corruption she had trained to fight. This was wrongness that looked like rightness, that sounded like salvation. That made you want to agree even as your soul recoiled. She had encountered it once before on Morningstar. This time she would not let it spread. This time she would find the source and burn it out, no matter the cost. Even if the cost was discovering truths she was not prepared to face. 3 days. 3 days until the Inquisitor and the Dark Lord stood face to face, and the galaxy held its breath. The cathedral had changed. What had been a simple structure of stone and faith had transformed over 12 days into something that defied architectural logic. The walls still stood where they had always stood. The buttresses still supported the same weight. But the space inside had expanded in ways that violated geometry. Sauron stood at its heart, watching his followers work. They came in shifts, thousands of them now, not just from the Hive City, but from the surrounding agricultural zones. They brought offerings, food, tools, scrap metal, anything of value. But more importantly, they brought their faith, their devotion, their desperate, hungry need to believe in something that acknowledged their existence. And Sauron consumed it all. The phylactery crown had evolved. What had been crude psychic circuitry woven from 12 souls was now a vast network, a web of consciousness that extended throughout the cathedral and beyond. Hundreds of minds touched his now, their thoughts flowing through him like blood through a circulatory system. He could feel their joys, their fears, their small hopes and vast despairs. He could shape them, guide them, improve them. Vol 7 approached, his mechadendrites dragging across the floor with the weight of exhaustion. Or what passed for exhaustion in a being that was mostly machine. "My lord, the infrastructure improvements are ahead of schedule. Agricultural output has increased 23%. Worker accidents have decreased by 40%. The administratum representatives are pleased, if confused." Good. Sauron did not turn from his contemplation of the growing congregation. Efficiency attracts less attention than collapse. The Imperium tolerates heresy more easily when that heresy produces results. "But my lord, the Inquisition is here." Now Sauron turned. Here? In orbit? They made planetfall 3 hours ago. An Inquisitor of the Ordo Malleus, accompanied by a full retinue. They are investigating, asking questions. Sauron felt something that might have been anticipation, or might have been dread. The two emotions had become increasingly difficult to distinguish. And what are they learning? That you have improved efficiency, raised morale, increased productivity. By every measurable metric, your presence has benefited the Imperium. Vol 7 paused. They find this suspicious. Of course they do. Sauron began walking toward the cathedral's entrance. His robes, now woven from shadow stuff and the prayers of the faithful, trailing behind him like smoke. The Imperium has spent 10,000 years teaching its servants that suffering is holy. Improvement without suffering violates their fundamental theology. My lord, if the Inquisition determines you are a threat, then I will speak with them. Explain my purpose. Show them the truth they have been afraid to acknowledge, that their emperor's way has failed and a new way is necessary. Vol 7's optical sensors flickered with what might have been concern. Inquisitors do not negotiate, my lord. They purge. Then let us hope this one is wiser than most. Sauron stepped into the cathedral's entrance chamber, once a simple vestibule, now a space that seemed to exist slightly outside normal reality. The walls were inscribed with prayers that shifted when observed, their Gothic script flowing like water, forming patterns that were simultaneously imperial devotion and something else, something older. He could feel the Inquisitor approaching. Her mind was different from the others, sharp, disciplined, fortified by decades of training and faith that had been tested and survived intact. She would not be converted easily. Perhaps not at all. Good. He preferred challenges. The cathedral doors opened, and she entered. Inquisitor Vaelith Sarros had seen horrors that would break ordinary minds. She had watched worlds burn, had interrogated demons, had walked through hive cities where chaos had turned reality inside out and people wore their organs as decorations. She had developed an immunity to shock, a professional detachment that allowed her to witness atrocity and still function. But walking into this cathedral, she felt something she had not felt in decades: uncertainty. The space was wrong, but not in the way she expected. It did not reek of corruption. The air did not taste of sulfur or rot. There were no obvious mutations, no 8-pointed stars, no screaming faces in the walls. Instead, there was peace, order, a sense of purpose so strong it was almost tangible. The congregation, hundreds of them, packed into pews that had not existed from the outside, turned to look at her as one. Their faces showed no hostility, only curiosity, and beneath that, something that looked disturbingly like pity. They pity me, Vaelith realized with a shock. They look at an Inquisitor of the Ordo Malleus, and they feel sorry for me. At the chamber's far end, standing before an altar that seemed to shift between solid and translucent, a figure waited. He was tall, gaunt, wrapped in robes that absorbed light. His face was beautiful in the way sharp things are beautiful, all angles and intensity, with eyes that burned like cold stars. Upon his head rested a crown of shadows and screaming, pulsing with a rhythm that matched Vaelith's own heartbeat. She knew immediately, with the certainty of decades of experience, this was not human. Not entirely. Perhaps not at all. Her hand moved toward her bolt pistol, but before she could draw it, the figure spoke. "Peace, Inquisitor." His voice was gentle, almost kind. "I mean you no harm. I am here only to help." "Help!" Vaelith's voice was steel wrapped in ice. "By spreading heresy? By turning the faithful from the Emperor's light?" "Is it heresy?" the figure asked, walking slowly toward her. To answer prayers, the Emperor cannot. To provide purpose, he can no longer give. To reward faith that has gone unrewarded for 10,000 years. Vaelith's retinue, 20 of her finest stormtroopers, equipped with blessed weapons and unshakable faith, took defensive positions. But none of them raised their weapons. Something in the figure's presence made violence feel premature, inappropriate. "You will identify yourself," Vaelith commanded. "By the authority of the God Emperor and the Holy Ordos, you will Sauron." The name fell into the cathedral's silence like a stone into still water. It meant nothing to Vaelith. She had never heard it, had no reference for it in any imperial record. But saying it seemed to cause the figure pain, as if the act of claiming identity cost him something precious. "I am called Sauron," he continued, stopping 3 meters from her. "Though I have worn many names across many ages, I am not of your universe, Inquisitor. I am a refugee, an exile, something that fell between realities and landed here, in your terrible galaxy, your age of darkness and dying stars." Vaelith's mind raced. Not of your universe. That should have been impossible. But she had seen enough impossible things to know that the word meant less than most people believed. "A Xenos, then," she said, "or a demon lying about its nature?" "Neither, or both. Your categories do not apply to me, Inquisitor. I am something your Imperium has no framework for understanding." He tilted his head, studying her with those burning eyes. "But you are different from the others. You are questioning, wondering if I might be telling the truth." "I question everything," Vaelith said coldly. "It keeps me alive. And it makes you wiser than your peers." Sauron gestured to the congregation. "Look at them, Inquisitor. Truly look. Do they appear corrupted, tainted, driven to madness by demonic influence?" Vaelith looked and saw people who appeared healthier than they should, better fed, less exhausted. Their eyes held purpose instead of the hollow endurance that characterized most Imperial citizens. "They have been improved," Sauron said softly. "Agricultural efficiency is up, accidents are down, morale has never been higher." "By every metric your Imperium claims to value, I have made this world better." "Through corruption," Vaelith insisted, but even she heard the weakness in her own voice. Because if this was corruption, it was unlike any she had encountered. "Through purpose," Sauron corrected. "Through giving them what the Emperor promised but could not deliver, meaning, direction. The certainty that their suffering serves a real purpose, not just abstract theology." He took another step closer, and Vaelith's hand tightened on her bolt pistol's grip. "You can kill me, Inquisitor. You have that power. You can burn this cathedral, execute these people, cleanse this world with fire until nothing remains but ash and silence." He paused, his eyes meeting hers. "But ask yourself, what would you be defending? A faith that demands everything and gives nothing? An empire that consumes its own people like fuel, burning them to feed a war machine that will never stop? A god emperor who sits rotting on a throne of agony, unable to answer even one prayer among trillions?" "Silence!" Vaelith's voice cracked like a whip. "You will not." "I will speak truth," Sauron said, and his voice carried such absolute certainty that even Vaelith found herself listening. "Because someone must. Because this galaxy is dying, Inquisitor. Slowly, inevitably, collapsing under the weight of its own brutality. And everyone can see it except those like you, who have been trained to mistake suffering for strength." "The Emperor protects," Vaelith said, but the words felt hollow even to her. "Does he?" Sauron's voice was gentle, almost pitying. "Or does he simply demand protection? Does he shield humanity Or does he merely command humanity to shield itself in his name while he slowly dies? Vaelith's finger found her pistol's trigger. One squeeze, one shot, blessed bolt round straight through this creature's skull. End this. End it now before his words could... "Let me show you something," Sauron said, and before she could refuse, he reached out, not physically, but psychically. His consciousness touched hers, and she saw. The vision was not forced, not invasive. It simply was. As if Sauron had opened a door and she had walked through it before realizing she was moving. She saw the Emperor, not as propaganda depicted him, golden, radiant, eternal, but as he truly was, a corpse maintained by dark technology and 10,000 psyker souls sacrificed daily. A being whose suffering was so absolute that it leaked into the warp itself, creating currents of agony that fed the very chaos he had tried to deny. She saw the Imperium, not as a glorious domain of humanity triumphant, but as a failing empire held together by habit and fear, slowly collapsing inward like a dying star. Every year more worlds were lost. Every generation, humanity grew weaker, more desperate, more willing to sacrifice its children to buy one more day of survival. She saw the alternative, a future where someone, not replacing the Emperor but supplementing him, could provide what he no longer could. Purpose without suffering, faith that answered back, a hand reaching down instead of a distant light that illuminated nothing. And she saw herself, standing at a crossroads. One path led to the familiar certainty of her duty: purge the heretic, burn the faithful, cleanse the corruption. The other path led into unknown territory, questioning, investigating, perhaps even listening. The vision ended. Vaelith stumbled backward, her stormtroopers catching her. She felt violated, manipulated, shown truths she had no desire to acknowledge, but she could not deny what she had seen, because somewhere beneath the propaganda, beneath the training, beneath 60 years of unwavering faith, she had always known, had always suspected that the Imperium was losing, that the Emperor was failing, that humanity's long, slow death was inevitable. Sauron had simply given voice to the doubts she had spent a lifetime suppressing. "You," she managed, her voice hoarse. "You showed me lies." "Did I?" Sauron asked gently. "Or did I show you truths you have been forbidden to acknowledge?" Vaelith raised her bolt pistol, aiming directly at his head. Her hand was steady. Her faith was iron. She could end this, should end this. But she did not fire. "Why?" she whispered. "Why are you doing this? What do you gain?" Sauron smiled, a sad, almost weary expression. "What I have always sought, Inquisitor. Order, purpose. A universe that makes sense instead of one ruled by madness and entropy. I do not wish to destroy the Imperium. I wish to save it from itself. By replacing the Emperor. By helping him. By becoming what he can no longer be, present, active, capable of answering his faithful." The rationalization was perfect. The logic was flawless, and that made it more dangerous than any demon's temptation. Because demons offered power at the cost of corruption, but Sauron offered purpose at the cost of what? Loyalty redirected? Faith reformed? Heresy that looked almost like orthodoxy? Vaelith's mind raced through scenarios. If she killed him now, she would be following protocol, defending the faith, doing her duty. But if she investigated further, if she discovered that he was actually helping, that his presence genuinely improved imperial efficiency, that his methods produced results the ecclesiarchy could only dream of, what then? "I need time," she heard herself saying. "Time to investigate, to determine the truth of your claims." Sauron inclined his head. "Take all the time you require, Inquisitor. I will be here, improving this world, helping these people, serving the Imperium in ways your Emperor cannot. If I determine you are a threat, then you will do your duty. I would expect nothing less. Vaelith lowered her pistol slowly, hating herself for the weakness but unable to deny the logic. She needed more information, more evidence, more time to determine if this was corruption or evolution, heresy or adaptation. She turned to leave, her retinue following, but paused at the threshold. "One question," she called back. "This name you claim, Sauron, what does it mean?" For a moment, the figure's face showed something almost like regret. "In my original language, the abhorred, the hated, the thing that everyone fears but no one can destroy." He paused. "I wore it as armor once. Now I wear it as penance." Vaelith left without responding, but his words echoed in her mind as she walked back through the Hive city's streets. Behind her, in the Black Cathedral, for that was what the faithful had begun calling it, Sauron stood alone and felt the weight of his own lies pressing down like gravity. He had told her truth, mostly. The Imperium was dying. The Emperor was failing. Humanity needed something more than distant faith. But he had not told her the cost. Had not mentioned that every soul he converted, every mind he touched, every moment of devotion he consumed brought him closer to becoming something that would make the Chaos Gods look merciful by comparison. He was building an empire on foundations of faith. But faith in this universe was not pure. It was tainted by the warp, corrupted by 10,000 years of suffering, poisoned by the very gods he sought to resist. And every day he felt himself changing, adapting, becoming less Maia and more something else. In the warp, Tzeentch laughed with genuine delight. The experiment was proceeding perfectly. Vaelith spent 7 days investigating. She interviewed hundreds of citizens, reviewed agricultural reports, analyzed psychic signatures, consulted with administratum officials who were simultaneously pleased and confused by Thessal Prime's unprecedented efficiency gains. Every piece of evidence pointed to the same impossible conclusion. Sauron's presence was helping. Crime rates had plummeted. Worker satisfaction had soared. Even the planet's tithe production had increased to levels not seen in centuries. By every metric the Imperium claimed to value, this world was thriving. And that terrified her more than any demonic corruption ever could. She stood in her temporary headquarters, a requisitioned administratum facility, surrounded by data slates and growing doubt. Malthus floated nearby, his servo skull frame clicking with agitation. "Your assessment remains unchanged, Inquisitor?" "I don't know what my assessment is anymore." Vaelith rubbed her temples, feeling a headache building behind her augmetic eye. "Everything I've learned says this entity should be purged, but everything I've observed says doing so would harm the Imperium more than help it. Perhaps that is the corruption, making itself appear beneficial. Perhaps. Or perhaps..." She trailed off, unable to finish the heretical thought. Or perhaps the Imperium's methods are so brutal that even genuine improvement looks like corruption. The Voxcaster on her desk crackled to life, interrupting her thoughts. The voice that emerged was panicked, breaking protocol. "Inquisitor! Warp signatures detected at the system's edge. Multiple contacts. They're... Emperor's mercy. They're translating in-system. Chaos Warband. Repeat! Chaos Warband inbound to Thessal Prime." Vaelith was moving before the transmission ended, her bolt pistol already in hand. How many? 15 vessels, mostly raiders but 2 cruiser-class signatures, identifying marks consistent with the Blood God's servants. Cornate warriors, Inquisitor. Estimated arrival, 4 hours. 4 hours. Barely enough time to organize a defense, let alone evacuate. "Alert the planetary defense forces. Mobilize every guardsman on the surface and someone find that damned herald and... I am here." Vaelith spun to find Sauron standing in her headquarters doorway as if he had materialized from shadow. The phylactery crown pulsed with an intensity she had not seen before, and his eyes, those terrible burning eyes, reflected something that might have been concern or might have been anticipation. "How did you—" She caught herself. Stupid question. "Khornate raiders are inbound. 15 ships. If you have any genuine desire to help the Imperium, now would be the time to prove it." Sauron stepped into the chamber, and Vaelith's stormtroopers immediately raised their weapons. He ignored them, his attention focused on something only he could perceive. "Khorne," he said softly, and something in his voice suggested he was not surprised. "Of course. I should have anticipated this. I have been building order, structure, dominion through will rather than violence. Everything the blood god abhors. Can you fight them?" Sauron turned those burning eyes on her, and for the first time Vaelith saw something in them that might have been honest doubt. "Fight them? No, not directly. I am still diminished, still adapting to this universe's rules. A direct confrontation with Khorne's champions would end poorly." He paused. "But I do not need to fight them. I need only to ensure they destroy themselves." "Elaborate, quickly." "Khorne's servants crave blood and skulls. They do not strategize. They do not plan. They simply attack, kill, and offer the carnage to their god. That singularity of purpose is both their greatest strength and their fatal weakness." Sauron moved to Vaelith's tactical display, his fingers tracing patterns across the hololithic projection of Thessal Prime's surface. "We cannot defeat them through military might, but we can manipulate the battlefield, channel their rage, turn their strength against itself." Vaelith found herself leaning forward despite her distrust. "How?" "By giving them exactly what they want, and making it their doom." 3 hours and 47 minutes later, the blood god's servants made planetfall. The sky above Thessal Prime's primary hive city split open like a wound, and from it poured drop pods painted in arterial red and brass. They crashed into the upper hive levels with impacts that shattered ferrocrete and sent shockwaves through the entire structure. From each pod emerged warriors who had long ago abandoned humanity for something cruder and infinitely more violent. Chaos Space Marines of the World Eater's Legion, their armor covered in brass icons and dried blood, their minds reduced to a single imperative: kill, maim, burn. At their head came Demon Prince Vrakath the Ever-Bleeding, a creature that had once been a Space Marine captain but was now something far worse. He stood 4 meters tall, his body a fusion of muscle and brass, bleeding from wounds that would never heal and did not need to. His axe, Gorechild's bastard son, had tasted the blood of saints and Xenos warlords alike. He surveyed the hive city with eyes that saw only prey and felt a savage joy. This world stank of order, of structure, of the very things Khorne despised. It would burn beautifully. "Blood for the blood god!" Vrakath's roar shook the air itself, and his war band echoed it with voices that were barely human. They charged into the hive's upper levels, chain zords screaming, bolters thundering, slaughtering everything in their path. The PDF forces met them with courage and immediately died. These were farmers trained for basic defense, not warriors capable of confronting the blood god's chosen. They fell in waves, their blood painting the streets, their skulls added to the harvest. And Vrakath laughed, because this was what existence should be: simple, violent, pure. But then he noticed something strange. The defenders were retreating. Not fleeing in panic, retreating in order, following a pattern, drawing the Khornate forces deeper into the hive through specific corridors toward a specific destination. Vrakath's predatory instincts stirred. This was a trap, obviously, crudely, which meant his honor demanded he spring it. He followed, his warband surging behind him like a red tide, and emerged into a vast open space, one of the hive's central manufacturing districts, now cleared of civilians and equipment. Empty except for a single figure standing at its center. Sauron. The Dark Lord stood alone, the phylactery crown blazing with psychic energy, his form wreathed in shadows that seemed to writhe with independent life. Around him, inscribed in the ferocrete itself, were symbols that made Vrakath's corrupted eyes burn, not sigils of chaos but something older. Something that spoke of binding and dominion. "Welcome, champion of the blood god," Sauron said, his voice carrying across the empty space with unnatural clarity. "I have been expecting you." Vrakath grinned, exposing teeth that were more brass than bone. "You dare face me alone, sorcerer? Your arrogance will be your death." Arrogance? Sauron tilted his head. "No. Strategy. You see, I have learned much about your god in my time here. Khorne values martial honor, direct confrontation, blood spilled in honest combat. He despises sorcery, trickery, cowardice." "Then you know your death will be glorious," Vrakath charged, his warband following, 100 Khornate warriors screaming their devotion. Sauron did not move, did not flinch. He simply raised one hand, and the floor beneath the charging warriors exploded upward, not with fire or sorcery, with something far more mundane: industrial machinery. The manufacturing district had been built atop ancient foundries, massive automated systems that had been dormant for centuries. Sauron had spent 3 hours studying their controls, learning their functions, preparing them for this moment. Hydraulic crushers erupted from the ground, catching a dozen berserkers and compressing them into screaming cubes of ceramite and flesh. Conveyor systems roared to life, dragging warriors into furnaces hot enough to melt plasteel. Robotic arms, designed for assembling tanks, grabbed Chaos Marines and tore them apart with mechanical indifference. It was not sorcery. It was engineering. Violence delivered through logic and planning rather than raw rage, and it drove Vrakath absolutely mad. "Coward!" the demon prince roared, leaping over the industrial carnage toward Sauron. "Face me with honor!" Sauron waited until the last possible moment, then stepped sideways, not physically, but through the warp, teleporting 3 meters to the left as Vrakath's axe obliterated the space where he had been standing. "Honor is a lie you tell yourselves to justify slaughter," Sauron said calmly, appearing behind a support column. "I prefer truth. Survival requires intelligence, not strength." Another charge, another dodge. Sauron was not fighting. He was evading, leading, controlling the battlefield without ever raising a weapon. And with each evasion, Vrakath grew more enraged, more careless, more focused on the kill rather than the victory. The remaining berserkers followed their prince, charging through the industrial hell, their discipline, such as it was, dissolving into pure bloodlust. They attacked the machinery when they could not reach Sauron. They attacked each other when the frustration grew too great. From observation posts around the district's perimeter, Vaelith watched with something approaching horror. She had seen many battles, but never one conducted like this. Sauron was not fighting the Chaos Marines. He was making them fight themselves, turning their own rage into a weapon against them. "Is this heresy?" one of her stormtroopers whispered. "I don't know," Vaelith admitted. "But it's working." The battle lasted 17 minutes. When it ended, 93 Khornate warriors lay dead or dying, killed by machinery, by their own rage turned inward, by the simple fact that Sauron had understood them better than they understood themselves. Vrakath stood alone among the carnage, bleeding from a dozen wounds, his warband reduced to corpses and screaming wounded. He stared at Sauron with something that might have been respect, or might have been purest hatred. are no warrior," he rasped, his voice thick with blood. "No," Sauron agreed, walking slowly toward the demon prince. "I am something far more dangerous. A planner, a schemer. A mind that sees patterns where you see only targets." Vrakath tried to swing his axe one final time, but exhaustion and blood loss made the movement slow, clumsy. Sauron caught the weapon's haft and screamed. The demon prince's axe was not merely a weapon. It was a conduit for Horn's power, saturated with millennia of bloodshed and rage. Touching it was like plunging his hand into a furnace of pure fury. But Sauron held on, because he needed something from this creature, something more valuable than victory. Through the phylactery crown, through the connection forged by physical contact, Sauron reached into Vrakath's consciousness and pulled. Not gently, not with skill, with desperate, clumsy hunger. He consumed the demon prince's essence, not the flesh, but the rage. The pure, distilled fury that Khorne had cultivated over centuries. It was poison. It was agony. It burned through Sauron's being like acid, antithetical to everything he was. But he needed it. Needed the power. Needed the strength to survive in a universe where dominion through will alone was insufficient. Vrakath's eyes widened as he felt his essence being drained, felt himself diminishing. For the first time in centuries, he felt something other than rage. Fear. What are you... "Adapting," Sauron whispered, and squeezed harder. The demon prince's skull exploded. Not from physical force, but from psychic pressure. Sauron's will, bolstered by consumed rage, focused into a single point and released. Vrakath's body collapsed, leaking ichor and brass shards, and in the warp, Khorne felt the death of one of his favored champions. The blood god's attention turned toward Thessal Prime, focused on the strange entity that had killed his servant, and screamed with fury that shook the Immaterium itself. Sauron felt that scream like a hammer to his consciousness. He staggered, nearly fell, tasting blood that might have been real or might have been psychic trauma made manifest. But he remained standing. Vaelith and her retinue emerged from their observation posts, weapons ready but uncertain. The Inquisitor approached slowly, her face unreadable. "You defeated them. Without sorcery. Without demon pacts. Using only..." "Strategy," Sauron finished, his voice hoarse. "The application of intelligence to conflict. Something your Imperium has forgotten in favor of brute force and martyrdom." He turned to face her, and Vaelith saw that his eyes had changed. The cold fire was still there, but now it was shot through with veins of red, pulsing with barely contained rage. "I consumed the demon prince's essence," Sauron said quietly. "Not by choice, but because survival requires adaptation, and adaptation requires sacrifice. You consumed a demon." Vaelith's voice was flat. "That is corruption. That is necessary." Sauron's hand trembled as he lowered it to his side. "Do you understand yet, Inquisitor? This universe does not permit purity. It demands compromise, change, the integration of darkness to fight darkness. I am becoming something monstrous to fight monsters. And so is your Imperium. It simply lacks the honesty to admit it." Vaelith stared at him, and for the first time in 60 years of service, found herself genuinely unsure what to do. He had saved the planet, protected billions of Imperial citizens, defeated a chaos warband using methods that violated no strictures against sorcery or warpcraft, but he had also consumed a demon's essence. Was changing, becoming something that did not fit any category she had been trained to recognize. "I need to think," she said finally. "I need to..." "Report to your superiors," Sauron finished. "I know. Do what you must, Inquisitor. But know this. Khorne's attention is now on this world. His servants will return, in greater numbers, with greater fury. And when they do, you will have a choice. Accept my help, or face them alone. He began walking away, back toward his black cathedral, leaving Vaelith standing among the corpses of Chaos Marines and the ruins of industrial machinery. She watched him go and felt the weight of impossible decisions pressing down. Behind her, Malthus floated close. "Inquisitor, your orders?" Vaelith was silent for a long moment. Then, "We watch, we wait. We prepare for what comes next. And if he truly is corruption, then we burn him." She paused. "But if he is not, if he is genuinely trying to save the Imperium in his own twisted way, then what?" Vaelith had no answer, because for the first time in her career she had encountered something that might be worse than heresy, something that might be right. In the warp, 3 of the Chaos Gods stirred with interest, but the 4th, Khorne, felt only rage, and rage demanded satisfaction. The Blood God's gaze turned toward Thesal Prime, and across the galaxy, his servants felt the call. Blood would flow, skulls would be taken, and the strange entity that had dared defy him would learn what it meant to attract the Blood God's personal attention. The war had only begun. The astropathic message reached Terra 47 days after the Khornate attack. It traveled through the warp on wings of psychic desperation, carried by a choir of astropaths who burned themselves out transmitting across half the galaxy. By the time it reached the Astronomican's impossible light, only fragments remained. Entity of unknown origin, not chaos, not Xenos, improves efficiency but corrupts faith, requests audience, claims to serve the Emperor's true purpose. Inquisitor Sarros requests guidance. The message was received by the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, analyzed by the inquisitorial representative to the Senatorum Imperialis, and ultimately presented to the High Lords of Terra in a sealed chamber where even thoughts were monitored for corruption. They debated for 6 hours. Some called for immediate exterminatus. Others demanded investigation. A few, very few, wondered if the entity might actually be useful. In the end, they issued no formal response. The Imperium was too vast, too bureaucratic, too ossified by 10,000 years of procedure to act quickly on anything less than galactic invasion. But the message reached one other place, one consciousness that existed beyond the High Lord's authority, beyond even the Inquisition's purview. The message touched the edges of the Emperor's awareness, and for the first time in millennia, something in that vast, suffering consciousness stirred with recognition. Sauron felt it like a hammer blow to his soul. He was in the Black Cathedral, which had grown again, its impossible architecture now spreading through the Hive City like a cancer of faith, when the Emperor's attention found him. Not intentionally, not even fully consciously, but like a blind man's hand brushing against something unexpected. The God Emperor's psychic presence swept across Thesal Prime and touched the entity that should not exist. The phylactery crown exploded with light. Sauron screamed, a sound that emerged in frequencies that shattered glass and made his faithful collapse in sympathetic agony. He fell to his knees, hands clutching his head, as the Emperor's consciousness pressed against his own. It was not an attack. It was recognition. Because the Emperor had seen things like Sauron before, had been things like Sauron, ancient powers from ages before humanity, beings who sought to shape reality according to their vision of order. The Emperor had spent 30,000 years eliminating such competitors, absorbing their knowledge, claiming their power. He had thought them all gone, dead or fled or integrated into his own vast consciousness. But here was another. Impossible. a remnant from a universe that should not connect to this one, operating by rules that predated the warp's madness. The Emperor's attention was not gentle. It crashed through Sauron's defenses like a tidal wave, peeling back layers of deception and self-delusion, exposing the truth of what he was becoming. And Sauron saw himself through the Emperor's perception, a being of order trying to exist in a dimension of chaos and failing. Every soul he consumed was corrupting him further. Every moment he spent in this universe was rewriting his fundamental nature. The Maia he had been was dying, being replaced by something new, something that was neither demon nor mortal, neither god nor machine, but a hybrid that violated every cosmic law. He was becoming a tumor in reality, a cancer of dominion, something that, if allowed to grow, would make the Chaos Gods look like minor afflictions. And the Emperor showed him the end point. Sauron fully transformed, a fifth Chaos God of order and domination, eternally at war with the Four, turning the galaxy into a battlefield where every soul was a soldier and every planet a fortress, an eternity of structured suffering, tyranny made manifest and eternal. It was everything Sauron had ever wanted, and it was absolutely, horrifyingly wrong. The vision broke. The Emperor's attention withdrew, pulled back to the endless war. He fought in the warp against the Four Powers, but he left behind a message, not words, but a sensation. You and I are the same, and that is why you must be stopped. Sauron collapsed on the cathedral floor, gasping, tasting blood and ash and the bitter flavor of recognition. Because the Emperor was right. They were the same. Two beings who had looked upon chaos and decided the solution was absolute order, perfect dominion, the elimination of free will in favor of directed purpose. In Middle-earth, Sauron had justified his tyranny by claiming he was bringing order to a disordered world, making things better through control. The Emperor had done exactly the same thing and created the Imperium, a civilization so brutally ordered that it was indistinguishable from damnation. For the first time in uncounted millennia, Sauron felt something he had thought himself incapable of: doubt. Not doubt about his goals, not doubt about his methods, but doubt about whether the goal itself was worth pursuing, whether order achieved through dominion was any better than the chaos it sought to replace. "My lord?" Vaelith's voice. She had been in the cathedral when it happened, witnessing Sauron's collapse, his scream, the moment when something vast and terrible had touched him and found him wanting. Sauron looked up at her with eyes that now contained something they had not held before: genuine uncertainty. "I saw him," he whispered. "Your Emperor, the god you serve. He showed me what I am becoming." Vaelith approached slowly, her bolt pistol drawn, but not aimed. She had spent 73 days on Thessal Prime now, watching Sauron work, investigating his methods, trying to determine if he was salvation or damnation. She still did not know, but she had learned one thing: he was not lying about trying to help. "What did he show you?" Sauron pulled himself to his feet, the phylactery crown still smoking, its structure cracked but holding. "The truth. That I am becoming exactly what I sought to destroy. That my order is just another form of chaos wearing a prettier mask. That dominion through will is no better than dominion through violence, just slower, more insidious, more permanent." He turned to face her fully, and Vaelith saw something in his expression she had never expected: fear. "I have spent eons believing I was right," Sauron said quietly. "That my way was the only way." That freedom was chaos, and chaos was suffering, so therefore the elimination of freedom was mercy. I built an empire on that belief. Corrupted kingdoms, enslaved nations, turned free peoples into extensions of my will. He gestured to the cathedral around them, to the thousands of faithful who had bent toward him like flowers toward sunlight. And here I am, doing it again, telling myself it is for their own good, that I am saving them from a crueler master, that my tyranny is kinder than the Imperium's. But it is still tyranny. Still the elimination of choice in favor of purpose I dictate. Vaelith found herself holding her breath. This was not the speech of a demon, not the rationalization of a heretic. This was something rarer and far more dangerous, genuine introspection from a being of immense power. "So what will you do?" she asked carefully. Sauron was silent for a long moment. Outside, through the cathedral's impossible windows, Thessal Prime continued its daily rhythm, farms producing food, workers laboring with newfound efficiency, people living better lives than they had in generations. All because of him. All because he had given them purpose and direction and the certainty that their suffering mattered. Was that wrong? Was lifting them from despair into meaning truly evil, even if it meant binding them to his will? "I do not know," he admitted finally, and the admission cost him something precious. Pride, perhaps, or certainty. In Middle-earth, I never questioned my purpose. Even in defeat, even as the ring burned and my essence was cast into the void, I knew I was right. But here... He looked down at his hands, translucent, flickering, shot through with impossible colors and the faint shimmer of warp taint. Here I am changing, becoming something I do not recognize, and I find myself wondering, is it the universe changing me? Or am I simply becoming what I always was beneath the justifications? Vaelith holstered her bolt pistol, slowly, deliberately, making a choice that would either be recorded as the greatest mistake of her career or the most perceptive decision she ever made. "I have spent 73 days investigating you," she said, "watching you work, examining the effects of your presence, and I have reached a conclusion." Sauron waited, and for the first time, he genuinely did not know what she would say. "You are dangerous," Vaelith continued. "Possibly more dangerous than any entity I have encountered in 60 years of service. But you are not chaos. You are not a demon. You are something I have no framework for understanding. And that terrifies me more than any corruption I have been trained to fight." She took a step closer. "But I have also watched you save this world. Twice. From decay and from invasion. I have seen people thrive under your influence when they were dying under the Imperiums, and I find myself asking a heretical question. What if the Emperor's way is not the only way? What if there are forms of order that do not require such absolute suffering?" "That is heresy," Sauron said softly. "I know. But if recognizing truth is heresy, then perhaps the Imperium's definition of truth needs examining." They stood in silence, two beings from different realities confronting the same impossible question. How do you save a universe that is so broken that even salvation looks like damnation? "The Emperor showed me what I will become if I continue," Sauron said finally. "A god of dominion, a tyrant eternal. Everything I claim to fight against. But he also showed me something else." "What?" "That he sees the same future for himself, that he knows his Imperium is a slow-motion catastrophe, that he is aware on some level that his way has failed, but he is too far gone, too deeply committed, too corrupted by 10,000 years of worship as fuel to change course." Sauron turned to look at Vaelith directly. "He and I are the same, Inquisitor. Two tyrants who justified their tyranny as necessary order. The difference is that I still have a choice. I am not yet what I will become. I can still stop, change, choose a different path. Can you?" Vaelith's voice held genuine curiosity rather than challenge. "Can a being like you truly change? Can the drive for dominion be set aside Or is it too fundamental to your nature? It was the question Sauron had been asking himself since the Emperor's vision. In Middle-earth, he had been Meron the Admirable before he became Sauron the Abhorred, had been a servant of order and beauty before Morgoth's corruption, had chosen the path of dominion even if the choice had been made so long ago he barely remembered making it. Could he unchoose? Could he walk away from everything he had built here, from the thousands who now depended on him, from the empire he was creating? I do not know, he admitted. But I know this. If I continue as I am, I will become something worse than the Chaos Gods, a being of absolute order that eliminates not just freedom, but the very possibility of choice. That cannot be permitted. So what is your alternative? Sauron looked around the Black Cathedral, at the faithful who had given him their devotion, who had elevated him from diminished refugee to something approaching godhood. He could feel their faith flowing through the phylactery crown, sustaining him, strengthening him, corrupting him. And he made a decision that went against every instinct he possessed. I must leave, he said quietly. Disperse myself, become less concentrated, less powerful, less capable of the dominion that would destroy everything. Leave? You have an empire here, thousands who follow you. Power you have spent months building. You would abandon all of that? Not abandon. Transform. Sauron reached up and slowly removed the phylactery crown from his head. The agony was immediate and absolute. The crown had become part of him, its structure integrated with his essence. Removing it was like tearing out his own spine. He screamed, but did not stop. The crown came free, trailing threads of psychic energy like roots torn from soil. Sauron held it in trembling hands, looking at the thing he had crafted from suffering and souls. I will not destroy it, he said through gritted teeth, but I will no longer wear it. No longer concentrate my will through it. Instead, he held the crown out to Vaelith. I will become an idea rather than a presence, a philosophy rather than a person. I will embed myself in the way these people think, in the methods they use, in the questions they ask, not as a god to be worshipped, but as a voice suggesting there might be better ways than blind obedience to distant authority. Vaelith stared at the offered crown, understanding what he was proposing, to become a distributed entity, a thought virus, not dominating from a throne but infiltrating through education, through example, through the slow, patient work of changing how people perceive their relationship with power. It was still corruption, in a sense, still heresy, but it was heresy that looked almost like liberation. If I take this, Vaelith said slowly, I become complicit. I become part of whatever you are creating. Yes. The Inquisition will call it corruption. They will, and they may be right. But you believe it is necessary. I believe, Sauron said carefully, that the Imperium is dying, that the Emperor's way has failed. That something must change, or humanity will collapse under the weight of its own brutality. This is my attempt at that change. It may be wrong. It may be disastrous. But it is better than becoming what I would otherwise become. Vaelith reached out and took the crown. The moment her fingers touched it, she gasped. She felt the weight of thousands of souls bound within it, felt the power it contained, felt the seductive pull of dominion whispering that she could do so much good if only she would accept its gifts. She held it for exactly 3 seconds, then handed it to Malthus. Seal it, she commanded. Psychic dampeners. Maximum security. This artifact is too dangerous to be used, but also too valuable to be destroyed. Sauron nodded slowly, a gesture of respect. Wise. I will leave Thessal Prime. Spread my influence rather than concentrate it. Become a philosophy of ordered improvement rather than a person demanding worship. And if the Imperium hunts you for this choice, then I will evade them, as I always have. A ghost of his old confidence flickered across his features. I am very good at surviving, Inquisitor. It is perhaps my only genuine talent. He began to fade, not dying, but dispersing. His form grew translucent, less solid, as he released the concentrated power that had given him physical presence. The faithful throughout the cathedral cried out in confusion and loss as they felt their connection to him weakening. But he did not disappear entirely. He simply became diffuse, present in the way air is present, or gravity, an influence rather than an entity. His voice came from everywhere and nowhere. Tell them I have not abandoned them. Tell them the work continues. Tell them to question, to improve, to seek order that does not require suffering. And tell them that even gods can learn, even tyrants can change. Will you? Vaelith asked the empty air. Will you truly change? Or is this just another form of dominion wearing a kinder mask? No answer came. But somewhere in the foundations of the Black Cathedral, in the way its stones fit together, in the prayers inscribed on its walls, a presence remained. Not Sauron as he had been, but something new, something that had looked at what it was becoming and chosen, perhaps for the first time, to become something else. In the warp, Tzeentch watched with fascination approaching genuine surprise. The experiment had deviated from all predicted paths, and that made it infinitely more interesting. 6 months after Sauron dispersed himself across Thessal Prime, Inquisitor Vaelith Sarros stood in the ruins of what had been the Black Cathedral. It had not been destroyed, not conquered. It had simply changed. The impossible architecture remained, but now it served a different purpose. The faithful still came, but they no longer worshipped a single entity. Instead, they gathered to discuss, to debate, to question the nature of their service to the Imperium. They still believed in the Emperor, but their belief had evolved into something more complex, more thoughtful, more dangerous. Vaelith had spent those 6 months tracking the spread of what she had come to think of as the Sauron Doctrine. The idea that faith should be answered, that order need not require suffering, that humanity deserved better than 10,000 years of grinding desperation. It was heresy, undeniably. But it was heresy that improved efficiency, raised morale, and made imperial worlds function better. The administratum was confused. The ecclesiarchy was suspicious but divided. And the Inquisition? The Inquisition was hunting her. She had been declared excommunicate traitoris 3 weeks ago, for corruption, for complicity, for allowing a Xenos entity to infiltrate imperial space and failing to purge it with appropriate prejudice. She probably deserved it. Inquisitor, Malthus's servo-skull voice crackled beside her. The phylactery crown's containment is degrading. We must either destroy it or what? Use it? Become what he refused to become? The choice may not be ours to make. Vaelith turned from the cathedral's entrance to find a figure standing in the shadows. Not Sauron, not exactly, but a presence that wore his shape like a memory wearing flesh. You came back, she said. I never left. The voice was Sauron's, but quieter, lacking the certainty that had once defined him. I have been learning, watching, trying to understand if what I am doing is salvation or just tyranny in slower motion. And what have you concluded? The figure stepped into the light, and Vaelith saw that he had changed. The burning eyes were dimmer now, more human. The shadows that clung to him were thinner, less substantial. He looked diminished, weary, honest. That I do not know, Sauron admitted. Perhaps I am still corrupting, still binding wills to mine, just more subtly. Or perhaps I am genuinely offering an alternative to the Imperium's brutality. The line between liberation and domination is thinner than I ever imagined. He gestured to the cathedral, to the people gathering within it for their evening discussions. They are thinking for themselves now, questioning, choosing. That was never my strength, allowing choice. But I am trying, adapting, becoming something I was never meant to be, uncertain. The Imperium is coming for both of us, Vaelith said quietly. They will burn this world, execute everyone who has been touched by your influence. Cleanse it all with fire until nothing remains but ash and orthodoxy. I know. Sauron's voice held genuine sorrow. That is the Imperium's way. Destroy what cannot be controlled. But I have learned something in my time here, Inquisitor. Something that Middle-earth never taught me. What? That ideas cannot be killed. You can destroy the person who speaks them, burn the cathedral where they are discussed, execute everyone who believes them. But the idea itself? That survives, spreads, evolves, becomes something beyond any individual's control. He began to fade again, dispersing into the air like smoke. I was Sauron, the Lord of Gifts, the Deceiver, the Dark Lord who sought to dominate all life through will and cunning. But here, in this terrible galaxy of dying stars and broken faith, I became something else. Something that has no name because it has never existed before. What? Vaelith asked the vanishing presence. The answer came as a whisper from everywhere and nowhere. A tyrant learning to serve. A god learning to doubt. A being of absolute certainty discovering the terrible freedom of not knowing. Is that enough? Is that redemption? I do not know, but it is a beginning. And then he was gone. Not dead, not defeated, but scattered. Woven into the thoughts of 10,000 minds, embedded in the questions they asked, present in the way they reconsidered their relationship with power and faith and suffering. Vaelith stood alone in the cathedral as the inquisitorial fleet entered orbit above. She had perhaps an hour before the purge began. An hour to decide. Flee, or stand with the people she had spent 6 months protecting. She made her choice. As the first bombardment lances began to fall, as the cathedral started to burn and the faithful ran for shelter that would not save them, Vaelith activated her Voxcaster one final time. This is Inquisitor Vaelith Sarros, Ordo Malleus, to any who can hear this transmission. I have been declared traitor for protecting an entity that sought to help rather than harm. I do not know if my judgment was correct, but I know this. The Imperium's way is failing. The Emperor's dream has become a nightmare. And if questioning that is heresy, then perhaps heresy is what humanity needs. The transmission ended as the ceiling collapsed. But the words survived, transmitted, recorded, repeated, and across 100 worlds in 1,000 minds, a question took root. What if there was another way? In the aftermath, the Imperium recorded the Thessal Prime incident as a minor heresy, successfully purged. Inquisitor Vaelith Sarros was posthumously declared excommunicate traitoris. The entity known as Sauron was listed as eliminated, his influence cauterized with flame and faith. The records were thorough. The cleansing was absolute. The records were also wrong. Because ideas, once released, cannot be unthought. Questions, once asked, cannot be unasked. And a philosophy that promises purpose without suffering? That spreads faster than any virus, more persistent than any corruption. Across the Imperium, in 100 sectors, on 1,000 worlds, preachers began to phrase their sermons differently. Not heretically, never obviously, just adjusted. Asking why faith must always mean suffering, why service must always mean sacrifice, why the Emperor's protection always seems to require humanity to protect itself. The Inquisition hunted, the ecclesiarchy purged. But for every voice silenced, 3 more whispered the same questions in different words. And somewhere in the space between thoughts, in the gaps between faith and doubt, a presence watched. Not concentrated, not powerful, but persistent, patient. Learning what Middle-earth's Dark Lord had never understood, that true dominion comes not from forcing submission, but from offering alternatives to those who have forgotten choice, is possible. Sauron had sought to rebuild his empire in the 41st millennium. Instead, he had become something stranger, a virus of uncertainty in a civilization built on absolute certainty. A voice suggesting that even in the grim darkness of the far future, there might be more than war. Whether this was salvation or damnation, liberation or the slowest possible conquest, even he no longer knew. But the seeds were planted. The questions were spreading. And in the deep places of Terra, on a throne of eternal agony, the Emperor felt them and wondered if he should be terrified or grateful that he was no longer alone in his doubt.